Sabaudi Archipelago. A battered fishing boat that looked like it might fall apart at any moment eased into the dock. Kyle was the first to leap ashore, stretching and loosening his stiff joints. He walked up to the seaside villa and pushed open the heavy oak door. Two petite figures, leaving a faint trail of sweet perfume behind them, hurried into his arms like swallows returning to their nest. "Lord Kyle, you're finally back! We missed you so much." Sakura and Suzu clung to him, one on each side, their small heads nuzzling his chest. The scent of soap and flowers filled his embrace. Kyle smiled, his hands naturally settling around their slim waists as he breathed in the familiar fragrance with obvious satisfaction. "Ah, this is wonderful. There's no place like home." The two maids froze at once. They looked up from his chest, and their eyes swept over his shoulder to a reserved, black-haired girl standing a little ways behind him, quietly taking in the villa's interior with curious interest. Sakura and Suzu puffed out their cheeks at the same time, their voices threaded with a hint of sourness. "Lord Kyle brought back another girl." Girl! Perona, twin pigtails bouncing, floated out and circled Kyle, gleefully teasing him. A bead of cold sweat ran down his forehead. "You can't put it like that," he thought. Sakura and Suzu were brought here by Karen. Perona was recovered thanks to Moriah, and Robin came because she wanted to follow me. I, Kyle, have always acted with honor, a true gentleman. And I don't eat cilantro. Most of his companions had come to him out of gratitude and stayed because of his character. Moriah had saved them, Karen had mentored them, my hawk had taught them. In short, Kyle's generosity was endless. He reached out, pinched Sakura and Suzu's puffed cheeks, which felt pleasantly springy, and announced, "This is Nico Robin. From now on, she's our new companion." Mahawk walked past them without emotion, paying no attention to the little scene, and headed straight for the training ground in the yard. His sword was starting to itch. In his mind, nothing beat a good session of practice. Gyaah! New research material. Mariah's laughter echoed as his figure melted into the shadowed corner and disappeared. The scuffle at O'Hara had given him fresh ideas for experimenting with his devil fruit powers. Little Hawk, the sword fanatic, and Little Mo, the homebody, exchanged a look and quietly slipped away, leaving only Kyle and a cluster of chattering girls in the villa. Kyle called after them, "Nice work." They only shrugged and waved him off. That night, the long dining table sagged under a lavish spread. Sakura and Suzu hovered at the edge of the room, cheeks a little pink with embarrassment. Lord Kyle," Sakura said softly, "we're sorry. Our cooking might not be as good as Mr. Mahawk's." Kyle ignored the apology, grabbed a chunk of roasted meat, and stuffed it into his mouth with relish. Between chews, he teased, "Knife skills are a chef's foundation, and Mahawk's are unmatched. If he can't cut people to his satisfaction during the day, he at least gets to cut vegetables." Mahawk, sitting upright and methodically slicing a steak, froze mid-stroke. He lifted his hawk-like eyes to Kyle and asked in a flat tone, "Are there any powerful swordsmen left in the New World?" Ever since Mahawk had mastered Haoshoku Haki, he hadn't faced a fight that demanded his full strength in a long time. A sword only grows keener by testing it against worthy whetstones, worthy opponents that force it to be sharpened further. Kyle swallowed his food and considered the question. The current Mihawk really had reached the summit of swordsmanship. Across the world there were very few people who could make him uneasy. Let me think. He counted names off on his fingers. Saint Garling of the Gods' Knights is one. That bald Gorosei member who wields a first-generation Kaitetsu, Saint Nusjuro, should be very strong too. And Golden Lion's two-sword style, though part of that guy's power seems bound by the Supreme Great IP steering wheel. Oh, and Rayleigh hasn't gone rusty either. Kyle leaned in toward Mihawk with a mischievous smile. "So, Little Hawk, how about it? Want me to take you to Mary Giwai's to meet Saint Nusjuro? And then we'll grab the first-generation Ketsu and use it as a kitchen knife." Mihawk's eyes went bright at once. He set his fork and knife down, his face suddenly solemn in a way that left no room for a joke. "If you need it," he said. There was nothing playful in that answer. If Kyle actually wanted the blade, Mihawk would unhesitatingly draw his black sword and go with him all the way to the highest seats of power to fetch it. Seeing the change in Mihawk's expression, Kyle hurriedly waved his hands. I'm kidding. Now's not the time. But, Kyle added, his tone shifting, tomorrow I'll take you to meet Rayleigh. You two can spar a bit and have a few drinks afterward. Robin sat slightly apart at the table, picking at her food in tiny bites. She listened to them talk without speaking. Each word was familiar. She could translate them easily enough, but strung together, they made no sense to her. O'Hara's books had never mentioned any of this. What did it mean to go to Mary Gioi's? To meet the Gorosei? These were names that would make ordinary people tremble, and yet the others spoke of them as casually as if they were deciding which market to visit tomorrow. There were no rigid hierarchies here. Karen had come of his own free will. He simply wanted to improve. No stifling rules, and certainly no constant atmosphere of betrayal and mistrust. Lord Kyle liked to joke and do as he pleased, but when things got serious, he stepped up and took command. Mr. Mihawk, though outwardly cold, was unexpectedly gentle. Mr. Mariah was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming more human. Sakura, Suzu, and Perona fussed over petty things, but their eyes held no shadows. Robin watched Sakura moving around the table with the dishes, then looked across at Kyle, who was casually telling Mihawk to make 2 more plates. A warmth spread through her. She thought of how she had knelt and begged them to take her with them, and for the first time since then, she felt certain she had made the right choice. Her lips, which had been pressed tight for so long, finally eased into a small, quiet smile. Mama, Sauro, I think I've found people I can trust. I won't be alone anymore. 142, Vegapunk, cheesy beats. Time slipped by slowly under the languid sun of the Saboti archipelago. Before anyone realized it, months had gone past. Life on the islands went on as usual. The underworld ran smoothly under Karen's iron fist, Aaron Keel's villa grew louder and livelier, and most notably, Mihawk and Rayleigh spent their days clashing steel. Rayleigh's blade was steady as a mountain and deep as the sea, every move infused with the calm wisdom of a man who had weathered countless storms. Mihawk's sword, by contrast, was ruthless and inexorably sharp. Each swing of his black blade Yoru carried the intent to cut through everything in its path. They fought from dawn until dusk, the clear clang of metal on metal never ceasing. Their dozen strikes scored the deserted island's ground with crisscrossing ravines. When they finally stopped, Rayleigh smiled and handed Mihawk a bottle of wine. "You truly are terrifying, young man," he said. "Give it a few years, and this old body of mine won't be able to withstand your sword." Mihawk took the bottle without a word and tilted his head back, drinking deeply. The duel ended without a winner. 2 of the world's greatest swordsmen had turned a deserted island into a wasteland and finally sheathed their blades with no clear victor. But only the 2 fighters, and Aaron Keel, understood what the surface result hid. In Rayleigh's seemingly casual swordplay there was a calm control, an ease that left himself plenty of room to maneuver. The older, ginger-haired man had the sharper edge. Rayleigh had held back from beginning to end. His blades were more about direction and teaching than about killing. This legendary pirate, once called Pluton, had been in his prime that day. The depth and mastery behind his defense outstripped the younger Mihawk's most committed offense, and although Mihawk had poured everything into the fight, he ran up against a barrier he could not overcome. After the duel, the already distant Mihawk grew even quieter. He trained harder and longer than ever, claiming the villa's backyard training ground as almost his own, and the whistling of his black blade slicing the air became the villa's most familiar sound. When Aaron Keel announced he wanted to make another run to O'Hara, Mariah immediately volunteered to stay behind. With more and more companions gathering at the villa, security had become a real concern, and Mariah, now that he'd gained a deeper understanding of his shadow fruit, was the most reliable guardian they had for the Xiangbo Islands base. He usually shut himself away in the basement, dissecting shadows and refining his powers, but knowing Mariah was on watch, let Aaron leave with a lighter heart. "Gee-ha-ha-ha! Protecting the maids and the girls is part of a strong man's training," Mariah crowed, declaring his new role with uncharacteristic pride as Aaron prepared to depart. A small boat streaked down the Grand Line, moving with terrifying speed. At the stern, Mihawk stood calm and expressionless, blade in hand. He swung his black blade against the sea, smooth, precise arcs that carved deep, bottomless furrows through the water. Each cut kicked up a wall of spray and sent a brutal recoil through the air, the force pushing the little craft forward. The acceleration was enormous. Aaron lay back on the deck, watching clouds slide past, feeling the spray on his face. He grinned and called lazily, "I say, little hawk, practicing your swordsmanship and saving on fuel at the same time, are you?" Two birds with one stone. Practical, like a thrifty homemaker, Aaron Keel remarked, amused. My hawk said nothing. He only quickened the rhythm of his sword swings, each arc cleaner and harder than the last. "Hey, little hawk," Aaron continued, carelessly talking to himself. "Are you still savoring Rayleigh's blade?" He grinned. "That old man, he's a real monster from the old days, same as me. He's got tricks you can't see coming. If he had wanted to win for good, your fancy coat wouldn't have saved you." My hawk's voice was low and steady. I know. There was no discouragement on his face. If anything, the sight of a higher peak only stoked the fire in his hawk-like eyes. The taste of a stronger sword had become fuel. The more he saw, the more fiercely he wanted to climb. Aaron smiled at that and fell silent. Not long after, the carcass of the giant fish they had killed, split open and stripped of its meat, bobbed up and down on the surf. "Well then," Aaron said with exaggerated gratitude, "wild dinner, thanks to nature's generosity." A few days later, land appeared on the horizon, the familiar, war-scarred silhouette of O'Hara. The small boat eased into the harbor, and as they drew closer, the island's silence settled over them like a blanket. The town lay flattened where cannonballs had struck. Streets were rubble and dust. The forests were blackened skeletons, charcoal trunks clawing at the gray sky. The once majestic, all-knowing tree stood as a charred stump, its husk a mute chronicle of the violence that had come through. And yet, among the ruin, there were unexpected signs of life. Several huge ships were moored at the island's old harbor. In the lake at the island's center, towering giants worked with specially woven nets, carefully hauling things up from the murky water. Bundles of waterlogged books, pages swollen and stuck together, were brought to the surface, laid out for initial drying and processing, then packed and carried onto the ships by another team. The whole operation was quiet and methodical, like a solemn ceremony. On the far shore, two figures watched in silence. One had an unnaturally large head and a habitual, thoughtful habit of poking his tongue out, an air of intense intelligence about him. The other wore a dark green cloak, held a bouquet of white flowers, and wore a grave expression. "Long time no see, Vegapunk," the cloaked man said, his voice low and resonant. Vegapunk turned. "Dragon!" he exclaimed. "I didn't expect to find the giant race here. O'Hara's knowledge must be preserved at all costs. This is a treasure for all humanity, and it must not be extinguished here." "Indeed." Dragon nodded, carefully setting the bouquet on the ground before him. He bowed toward the center of the lake, then straightened and let his gaze travel over the busy giants gathered around. At last, it settled on Vegapunk. The scientist's face was pinched with sorrow. "Those idiots in the world government," he said quietly, "they can destroy the carriers of knowledge, but they cannot destroy knowledge itself." A brief, almost bitter smile flickered across Dragon's features and was gone. The moment remained heavy with solemnity until a lazy voice called from behind them. "Yo, everyone's here!" Dragon went rigid. His dark green cloak snapped outward as if a gust of wind had hit it, though the air was still. An invisible pressure built around him, coiling like a storm waiting to break. Vegapunk's enormous head bobbed in exaggerated alarm as he muttered under his breath, "Dangerous reaction, extremely high energy level." Not far off, two figures were approaching at an unhurried pace. The man ahead wore a black trench coat and carried a mischievous smile. His golden eyes seemed to cut through the crowd, as if he could read everyone's hearts at a glance. The man walking behind him carried an enormous black blade across his back. His hawk-like eyes were as sharp as a knife. But when Dragon recognized the newcomers, the storm on his face vanished in an instant. The tightness in his features relaxed, and a genuine smile, almost a look of relief, flitted across his face. "Mr. Aaron Keel." Dragon stepped forward at once, dropping every ounce of caution. Aaron Keel lifted a hand casually in return. "Yo, long time no see, little dragon," he said, grinning. "Still plotting ways to give the world a good scare?" His gaze slid to the oddly proportioned man at Dragon's side, appraising him with amused interest. "And this is," Dr. Vegapunk instinctively pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. Behind the lenses, his eyes were wide with shock and confused. He felt like his circuitry was about to short out. The leader of the Revolutionary Army, standing casually with the notorious pirate known as the Wave Motion King, one of the highest profile names on opposite sides of the world, meeting here like this was more than he'd expected. Dragon turned slightly, his expression taking on a respectful gravity. "Mr. Keel, allow me to introduce. This is Dr. Vegapunk." "Doctor, this is Mr. Aaron Keel," Dragon said, turning to Vegapunk. He didn't explicitly announce Aaron's background, but no one in the room was so naive as to miss it. Aaron smiled and stepped forward. "So it's Dr. Vegapunk. I've heard a great deal about you," he said, extending his hand. Vegapunk paused a moment, then took it. The other's palm was warm and firm. There was no hostility in the gesture, only plain curiosity. "Aaron Keel-san," Vegapunk murmured, the name on his tongue like a question and a key both. "I've studied previous users of the wave fruit," he went on, voice quickening with excitement. "Most could only manipulate certain vibrations or particular kinds of waves, but your work follows a completely scientific logic. You're a genius. From a scientific standpoint, what you've done is nothing short of miraculous. It flies in the face of the known law of conservation of energy. How do you convert and control waves of entirely different natures? Sound waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves. Their media and frequencies are totally different. How do you switch between them seamlessly?" Well, the damned thirst for knowledge of a scientist. Before Aaron Keel could even open his mouth, Vegapunk began peppering him with questions. His eyes sparkled with scientific curiosity, sizing Aaron up not as a wretched pirate, but as a valuable subject. Aaron scratched his head and, deadpan, offered a ridiculous answer. "Probably goes like a peng and then a duong, and that's just how it happens." Vegapunk. Chapter 143. The Brain Fruit is terrifying. Vegapunk's huge head tilted a fraction, and the eyes behind his lenses, far from showing disappointment at the offhand answer, shone with an even keener light. Peng as an instantaneous release of energy, duong as the stable reconstruction of form. "So that's it," he murmured. "Was it a jump and transformation of energy completed in an almost infinitesimal instant?" He muttered the possibility to himself, completely absorbed. "A great scholar will parse the scriptures for me," he thought, picturing the patterns and equations that might explain it. Kyle felt a flush of awkwardness. Even the silly sound effects he'd tossed off at random were being dissected like a research paper. Vegapunk's usual evasive half-truths and bluffing didn't work on someone who lived 5 centuries ahead of everyone else. The scientist simply kept mining the tiniest clues for meaning. Deciding not to get outclassed, Kyle switched tack. If clever dodges failed, he could at least simplify. He cleared his throat and adopted a more earnest tone. "It's not that complicated," he said. "Think of everything as waves, just with different frequencies and amplitudes. At a microscopic level, the strings, call them whatever you like, vibrate in different modes. Those vibrations manifest as the particles and energy we observe. Change the vibration, and you change the particle's properties, or the way energy behaves." Vegapunk's pupils contracted with interest. The idea fit neatly into his own mental models. A sudden reconfiguration of oscillations could account for a rapid release of energy, followed by a new, stable arrangement of matter. He leaned forward, every little gear in his mind whirring. Kyle, comforted by the fact that he'd come up with an explanation that Vegapunk could relate to, let his guard down a little. He didn't know the details, but framing it as vibrations and mode changes gave the scientist a language he could use, and it bought Kyle a momentary reprieve from interrogation. "So-called devil fruit powers," Vegapunk said, "might simply alter the way a human body resonates with these strings." He had taken scraps of string theory and quantum mechanics he'd picked up in a previous life, wrapped them in the language of a pirate king's worldview, and tossed the idea out casually. Dragon and Mihawk stood by and listened, their faces saying very different things. Mihawk had already drifted away. Resonance, quantum strings, none of it interested him. In his mind, there was only Rayleigh's flawless swordplay, every movement replaying itself over and over. The cold weight of the black blade in his hand felt far more real than any speculation. For him, there was nothing to do but swing and strike. Kyle, meanwhile, mulled the idea over, turning it around in his head and weighing its implications. Dragon was different. He was just as confused by the terminology, but Vegapunk's growing excitement stoked something in him. Seeing that bright, feverish intensity, knowing who Vegapunk was, a scientific genius centuries ahead of everyone else, stirred a fierce, restless hope. Vegapunk wasn't just a clever man. He was the embodiment of wisdom, and the possibility he hinted at hit Dragon like a wave. Even Dragon, who already held Kyle's intellect in the highest regard, felt a chill at how far Kyle's knowledge must reach. This man did not simply possess a power that could upend the world. He commanded truths that even Vegapunk openly admired. As expected of Big Brother Kyle, Dragon thought, a bead of cold sweat tracing his temple. He had never been more certain that befriending Kyle had been the right move. String theory, quantum entanglement. Vegapunk whooped, slapping his thigh as his bulky frame quivered with excitement. So that's it. Why didn't I think of this earlier? I actually submitted a research proposal to the Gorosei once. I suspected devil fruits might be projections of higher dimensional energy, but they turned me down, saying it wouldn't yield practical results in the short term. Kyle-san, how did you observe these strings? Do you have the mathematical models? Questions came at Kyle in a rapid-fire volley. The young pirate snapped to attention, suddenly aware he had drawn far more scrutiny than he'd expected. Oh no, he thought, I really overdid it. He'd meant to land a dimension-reducing strike, but the other man not only stopped it, he actually asked Kyle how the formula behind it was derived. How was Kyle supposed to explain math to a genius like that? In his previous life, he hadn't even managed advanced math without his teacher's help. The brain fruit really was terrifying. Ahem, Kyle coughed twice, forcing a smile and steering the conversation away. Those are just half-formed conjectures, not worth taking seriously. Compared to that, Doctor, you're the real genius. Your work to change the structure of the world and bring about peace is far beyond my empty theories. Flattery worked exactly as it always did. Vegapunk's excitement cooled a little. A smug look slid onto his face, and he launched into a long, animated rundown of his research plans. Kyle let out a private, grateful breath. He'd managed to soothe the great scientist, at least for the moment. When Vegapunk paused to explain the pacifista's initial concept, Kyle took the opening to shift focus. He elbowed Dragon and gave him a nudge. Speaking of changing the world, he said, how are things on your end? Have you gathered your forces? Dragon's expression shifted at once, from the distant awe of someone listening to something otherworldly to the hard focus of a revolutionary. He nodded, voice steady. Thanks to your guidance, the group has already taken shape. We call ourselves the Revolutionary Army. Revolutionary Army, Kyle echoed, tasting the name. Dragon allowed himself a wry smile. But it's a long and brutal road. Waking the complacent and the numb is far harder than toppling kings and nobles. Every time we free a place, we have to pour enormous effort into spreading our ideas, building a new order, and making sure the old evils don't come crawling back. Still, there is good news. A light flickered in Dragon's eyes. A few like-minded people have joined us. Bartholomew Kuma, whom you mentioned, is an upright, kind man. And Ginny, she's a sun-bright, energetic girl. Their arrival has breathed new life into the cause. Kyle felt something stir in his chest. The inertia of history was still immense, but with his intervention their destinies might take a different course. Dragon's face grew serious again. Our latest target, he said, is the Sorbet Kingdom. Its king is tyrannical and unjust, and the people are suffering terribly. The Sorbet Kingdom, huh? Kyle rubbed his chin. I've heard of it. Are you sure you can do it? We have to, Dragon replied, decisive. A single spark can set the prairie ablaze. Kyle studied Dragon's face. The bewilderment was gone. Determination had taken its place. He smiled and clapped Dragon on the shoulder with more force than gentleness. Don't try to swallow everything at once. You can't get fat in one bite. History climbs in spirals. His gaze drifted over Dragon's shoulder to the giants carefully hauling books across the charred landscape. What you're doing now is speeding that process up. It will groan and maybe cost a few teeth, but the direction is right. Kyle, the old revolutionary mentor, was back in his element. Someone has to do these things, don't they? Dragon nodded heavily. Kyle's words always chased away the fatigue and doubts that sometimes crept in. The four of them walked toward the giants by the lake, chatting as they went. Across the water, the giants who were salvaging books noticed the small figures approaching. The lead giant, Helding, stopped what he was doing and frowned, his brow knitting together. A warrior's instinct prickled along his spine. These newcomers spelled trouble. The man with the enormous black blade slung across his back radiated a razor-edge menace. Just standing there, he felt like someone who treaded east would slit you open without warning. And the man in black at the front had an even more inscrutable presence, calm and motionless, like a deep sea without a single ripple. "Everyone, stay sharp!" Helding hissed under his breath, dropping into a defensive stance. The air tightened. For a heartbeat, the whole place held its breath. Dragon and Vegapunk fell silent, eyes sliding to the giants gathered on the opposite bank, who were already on high alert. A female giant beside Helding, her hair woven into a long golden braid, leaned forward to scrutinize Kyle's group. When her gaze fell on Kyle, confusion flitted across her face and then exploded into astonishment. She grabbed the tense Helding by the arm and cried out, clear and loud, "Are you, Mr. Kyle?" Her voice trembled with equal parts disbelief and excitement. "Mr. Jabba talks about you all the time." Chapter 144. Seraph Kyle? Kyle was momentarily taken aback, then recovered. He gave a slight bow and offered the tall female giant a polite, practiced smile. "Hello, beautiful lady. I hear Jabba hasn't exactly been flattering me behind my back." "That's not bad mouthing," the giant Jers beamed, clearly amused. She brought her huge palm down to pat Helding's shoulder, a clear signal for him to lower his guard. "Mister, Jabba says you're the most attention-seeking man he's ever seen on Roger's ship, always showing off at the crucial moments." At that, Helding's tense posture eased. The legend of the Roger pirates was well known even among the giant race. Since this man before them was a friend of Jabba's, any lingering hostility dissolved. Kyle laughed aloud, unashamed. "He's right. We were young and hot-blooded back then. If you're not reckless when you're young, are you even young?" His frank, easy manner won them over immediately. Gers threw her head back and laughed so hard the ample swell of her chest heaved, and Kyle felt a little dizzy from the sight and the sudden relief in the room. He instinctively looked away and muttered, "What a sin!" Someone nearby blurted, "Jabba? No, Big Brother Jabba, I get you now!" The tension in the air melted away. Vegapunk, who had been silent until now, suddenly looked a little flustered. He pushed his glasses up, eyes lingering on the rows of drying books with a kind of reverent longing. After a moment's hesitation, he found his voice almost pleading. Friends of the giant race, I'm Vegapunk. May I look at these books? I swear I'll only read them. I won't take a single page. The knowledge of O'Hara is a treasure of the world. I only want to record it." "Vegapunk?" Helding repeated the name, then realization dawned on him. "I've heard of you. You're supposed to be the smartest man in the world." Although the giants had heard the scientist's name for some time, his official ties to the world government made them instinctively suspicious. Seeing their hesitation, Kyle stepped forward and spoke up at just the right moment. "The doctor's my friend. He's not like those fools in the world government. Let him look. If this knowledge is going to sink to the bottom of the lake, it's better that the smartest man alive stores it in his head." "Who knows? It might come in handy later," Kyle said. With Kyle vouching for him, the giants no longer hesitated. "If he's Mr. Kyle's friend, then of course it's fine." Helding agreed readily. "Excellent." Vegapunk practically squealed with delight. He lunged for a nearby stack of dusty tomes, snatched one up, and his eyes scanned the pages like a high-speed reader. Page after page of information was devoured by his vast mind with almost inhuman efficiency. He sank into the sea of knowledge, muttering to himself, frowning at times, suddenly brightening at others, as if nothing else in the world existed. Dragon watched from the edge of the clearing, and his opinion of Kyle climbed another notch. Whether it was leaders of the Revolutionary Army, the legendary giant tribe, or leading scientists, Kyle had an uncanny ability to connect with people and win their trust. That kind of charisma was a dangerous kind of power. My hawk, on the other hand, leaned back against a scorched tree trunk and closed his eyes. He had no interest in the scholarly bustle. His thoughts replayed, over and over, the duel he'd had with Rayleigh. Kyle, by contrast, had already become one of the giants. His emotional intelligence and quick wit had won over those blunt, straightforward warriors in no time. The camp rang with laughter as they traded jokes and stories. Then his smile faded and his tone grew serious. "Everyone," he said, "if any of you see Sauro, please give him a message." The giants fell silent and turned to him, attentive. Kyle spoke slowly and deliberately. "Tell him Robin is doing very well. She's got a noisy but reliable group of companions and a home where she can sleep peacefully. She's not alone anymore. Tell him not to worry." Helding and the others nodded solemnly, committing the words to memory. "We'll deliver the message, Mr. Kyle," Helding promised. Kyle smiled. As far as he knew, Sauro had survived Sakazuki's attack, a true, almost legendary, unkillable king. Nearby, Vegapunk remained lost in a sea of knowledge, juggling 3 or 4 books salvaged from the lake bed. The pages flipped with uncanny speed, as if turned by invisible hands. His eyes flicked across the pages like a precision scanner, darting from one line to the next. His brain drank in Ohara's legacy of knowledge with terrifying efficiency, and yet he answered Kyle and Dragon without missing a beat. "Vegapunk," Dragon asked, taking the initiative. He was worried about anything that might change the world's balance. "How is that research you mentioned earlier coming along?" "Oh, you mean the cloning technology," Vegapunk said without looking up, still immersed in the books. "Since Mads disbanded, I've been refining it. The first successful product was Stussy. You should have heard of her, but it's still imperfect. There are certain unique physiques that I can't fully recreate." At last he looked up, turning his large head toward Kyle. A fanatical light shone in his eyes. Kyle raised an eyebrow. He already suspected the real subject was about to be revealed. Vegapunk set the book down, rubbed his hands together, and began to pace. "What I'm trying to do now," he said, voice low and excited, "is combine the lineage factor of a certain very powerful individual with the lineage factor of the Lunarian race. And if you add my devil fruit theory, even though it's still only a theory, just imagine the kind of being that could be born from that." For a beat the room went utterly silent. Dragon felt his breath catch. In an instant he understood the terrible possibilities behind Vegapunk's words. Vegapunk stopped pacing and turned to Kyle, face suddenly grave. He bowed so low his oversized head nearly touched the floor. "Kyle-san," he said, voice heavy with respect, "I beg you, please allow me to take some of your blood for my research." "If the experiment works," Vegapunk went on, straightening, "we could create a clone based on you with the physiology of the Lunarian race. It would possess power beyond anything we've seen, power enough to put an end to the fighting on the seas. The false justice propped up by the fools in the world government would be exposed and destroyed, and real peace could finally fall across the world." My hawk, who had been motionless, opened his eyes a slit. His cold gaze flicked between Kyle and Vegapunk. Dragon's heart hammered in his chest. He stared at Kyle, waiting for an answer. This single decision could steer the fate of nations. Kyle didn't answer right away. He frowned, lost in thought. Seraphim Kyle? A perfect creation, it had inherited his talents and even bore the physique of the Lunarian race. Could this be his asexually produced offspring? His biological son? Kyle's mind spun. There was a dangerous possibility. A clone who refused to obey could turn into his worst enemy. Nobody knew his weaknesses as well as he did. What if this son put on an act of filial piety and then betrayed him? He let himself smile, half amused. If the boy turned out to be insolent, a little discipline would do the trick. A few sharp whacks with a 7 Wolves cigarette, and the problem would be solved. 3 quick hits, and the brat wouldn't be so defiant. Daddy's still daddy. That fleeting, dark joke passed quickly. What mattered was the opportunity. The world government was already moving in this direction. Rather than letting the Gorosei end up wielding a seraphim army modeled on the Shichibukai, it would be smarter to hold his own trump card, one built from himself and therefore theoretically stronger. Such a piece wouldn't just check the world government, it would be indispensable in any future scheme to overturn the world. He understood all of that. Kyle looked up, and the cynical smile returned to his face. Kyle extended his right index finger and pressed the tip Gen. Teal eye. A bead of crimson welled up, and under the control of his wave fruit, formed into a perfect droplet that hovered in the air. Take it, Doctor. Vegapunk reached forward eagerly with a specially designed containment vial, but Kyle's quiet voice stopped him mid-motion. I have one condition. He looked at the scientist calmly, unwavering, but weighted with intent. Not a single word about this to the world government. The existence of this creation must remain our deepest secret. My son is not a pet for the celestial dragons, Kyle added. Vegapunk froze for a heartbeat, then bowed his massive head and nodded. His voice was solemn, almost reverent. I give you my word as a scientist. This project will be run independently of any world government program. Ultimate authority will rest only with you and me. Good. Kyle flicked his finger. The suspended bead stretched into a thin red filament and flew precisely into the vacuum test tube Vegapunk had already prepared. Vegapunk cradled the test tube like a priceless relic, his face alight with the thrill of witnessing history. Dragon stood quietly to the side, tamping down the shock rising in his chest. His look toward Kyle, once simple admiration, had hardened into something like reverent awe. This man had a way, often unintentional, of arranging gambits on a global chessboard that could shake the world. Chapter 145. I'm actually not that interested in Bailey. Kyle's gaze moved from Vegapunk to Mihawk, who was leaning casually against a tree trunk, as unconcerned as ever. Since the boss has made his intentions clear, his subordinates can't just stand around, Kyle said with an easy grin and started walking toward Mihawk. Mihawk's hawk-like eye opened. The corner of it twitched almost imperceptibly. He could read the mischief in Kyle's smile. Don't be nervous, little hawk, Kyle said, patting his shoulder in a familiar tone. Just one drop. Quick. It won't hurt. Mihawk said nothing. He didn't resist, but his stern expression and the look in his eyes made his displeasure obvious. Kyle ignored the accusing glance, deftly collected a drop of blood, suspended it in the air as he had done before, and handed the vial to Vegapunk, who had moved closer. Doctor, this one's for you too. Vegapunk accepted the second tube. His eyes behind their lenses glittered like streams of data. Mihawk-san's lineage factor, his dynamic vision and innate swordsmanship, if those were combined with Lunarian genes, incredible. This would be the perfect swordsman, Vegapunk gushed, already lost in a feverish daydream. Kyle-san nodded with quiet satisfaction, watching the scientist run wild. I also have an old antique I'd like your help with, Kyle continued. He made a motion at his hip as if drawing a weapon. The air shimmered and fractured like a shattered mirror. When the light settled, an ornate flintlock pistol lay in his hand. Its body was carved from gold and ivory, filigreed with intricate patterns, Roger's own sidearm, Anne. This gun followed Roger, Kyle said, turning it over with a faintly contemptuous smile. Mostly it served as a lighter in his hands. Every so often he'd use it to shoot a gull for roasting. In a world where swords ruled, firearms had a somewhat awkward place. Vegapunk pushed his glasses up, eyes bright. He recognized the pistol's historical value at once, but what really excited him was the chance to tinker. If you'll let me, he said, I'd like to change the firing method. Something like electromagnetic propulsion, a rail or coil system. It would keep the look and history, but modernize its performance. My ability can come in handy, Kyle said, eyes glittering with the pleasure of someone who'd just thought up a wicked trick. He explained the idea in one breath. Special seastone rounds, infused with hockey, launched at an ultra-high initial velocity from an electromagnetic rail. Could any devil fruit user react in time? A delighted grin spread over his face. Don't move, devil fruit users. When you get bored of chasing people down, just use hockey to lock onto some poor soul 100 kilometers away, and he made a quick, playful whistling sound. Bew. One seastone dark bullet later, whether Logia or Mythical Zoan, they'd all be stunned. Scheming was a lot easier than chasing. Electromagnetic propulsion. Splendid. Vegapunk burst out, far more excited than Kyle, his enormous head leaning forward. This is brilliant. We can fit a miniature arc maxim power core, add a variable trajectory prediction system, use beta particles for energy amplification, and... He rattled off a string of technical terms Kyle didn't follow. Ha. Kyle cut him off, raising a hand. Doctor, everything you said sounds perfect. I thought of the same things. In short, I trust you completely. Make it as strong and as effortless as possible. Kyle had a talent for nodding as if he understood and then handing the real work off to the professionals. Vegapunk's excitement dimmed a little. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, a crease of concern forming on his brow. "But Kyle," he said, "both creating clones and completely reworking this weapon would take enormous funding and a totally independent laboratory. The world government money I get, it's watched by too many eyes." Silence settled over the room. It was a painfully practical objection. No matter how brilliant an idea, it still needed money as its foundation. You can't expect a clever cook to prepare a feast without rice, never mind the rest of that proverb. Dragon opened his mouth to reply, then hesitated. The Revolutionary Army was, bluntly, broke. It couldn't bankroll scientific projects on that scale. Kyle stayed quiet for a beat, thinking. Karen's sharp jaw and the brick-thick stacks of financial reports he'd filed flashed through his mind. On the Xiangbo Islands, Karen had turned every gray business into a relentless cash machine: nightclubs, gambling dens, funeral homes, special services, transport brokers, even arms dealing. Berries flowed into Kyle's coffers in ridiculous amounts every single day. The thought made the corner of Kyle's mouth curl into a small, satisfied smile. He looked up, first at the expectant Vegapunk and then at Dragon, who still looked uneasy. Kyle said one word softly, almost underplaying it. "Money? Money is the easiest problem to solve in this world," he added, spreading his hands in a gesture he'd used in his former life, his expression earnest. "To be honest, I'm not particularly interested in berries." Vegapunk blinked. Dragon's frown deepened. Mihawk paused mid-motion as he wiped his black blade. Kyle's tone shifted into something magnanimous, like a protagonist in a wealthy man drama. "Doctor, carry on with your research. Laboratories, equipment, materials, personnel. I'll cover every expense. I'll have my butler set up an account with no limits for you. All you need to do is turn these ideas into reality." He turned to Dragon, who had been silent until now. "Little Dragon, the same goes for you." Dragon looked up, eyes wide with astonishment. Kyle-san met him calmly. "Revolution isn't a dinner party. You can't take a single step without money. Rousing the public, setting up bases, buying weapons, gathering intelligence. Which of those doesn't cost anything? What you're attempting is the greatest and most expensive undertaking in the world," Kyle-san continued. "So don't stand on ceremony with me." His voice carried clean and steady across the ruined plaza. "Name your price. I'm investing in your revolution." By the lake, the giants were still ransacking the wreckage for books, oblivious to the moment that had just passed. In a few deceptively simple words, a transaction that could change the course of the world had been sealed. Dragon's heart pounded in his chest. He stared at Kyle-san's relaxed smile and found himself unable to speak. A pirate who had once rocked the seas without a care had just closed a deal with the leader of the Revolutionary Army, who was also the world's chief scientist. No matter how hard Karen pushed, there was only so much the Xiangbo Islands could yield. The territory was too limited for any real breakthrough. It was time to expand the business. Karen oversaw countless affairs and was running out of energy. He preferred to stay a white glove, a respectable front who never got his hands dirty. What he needed was a black glove, someone ruthless and discreet who could run the gray and black operations for him. The question was, where to find that kind of talent. Any guesses, Doffy? 146. Don Quixote family, high above the ruined island of O'Hara, a secret pact about the world's future was quietly sealed. Both Dragon and Vegapunk wore grave expressions. They understood exactly what this alliance meant. Dragon saw the first light of a new revolutionary movement, while Vegapunk saw endless horizons for scientific discovery. "I'll send someone to the Xiangbo Islands to work out the specifics," Dragon said in a low voice, casting a grateful look at Kyle. Kyle couldn't afford the trip himself, so there was no other choice. "Count me in too, Kyle-san," Vegapunk chimed in, clutching 2 test tubes like a child with a prized toy. "Once I organize this knowledge, I'll start new projects right away." Kyle waved them off with a casual hand and bid them farewell. The mood on the return voyage was muted. Mihawk sat alone at the ship's rail, methodically polishing his black blade, Yoru. The journey had been a disappointment for him. No duel, no challenge. Instead, he had been treated like a specimen, a single drop of his blood taken for research. A cold knot of frustration settled in him. Don't be so petty, little hawk, Kyle called lazily from the lounge chair. It's just a drop of blood. Think about it. Someday a perfect creation might be born that inherits your supreme swordsmanship and a Lunarian body. You should be happy. And besides, he added with a grin, wouldn't you love to spar against another you? Mahawk paused mid-wipe, his sword stilling. His sharp, hawk-like gaze slid over to Kyle, one look that plainly said, shut up. Kyle clicked his tongue. How boring. He pouted theatrically then, having tired of teasing, closed his eyes and let the sea breeze wash over him. Back at the Xiangbo Island villa, Mahawk said nothing. He headed straight for the training ground on the back mountain and began to train. Soon, a cutting, metallic aura of sword chi sliced the air around the hillside, the only sound that gave voice to his quiet indignation. Kyle only offered merciless mockery in return, then fell back into his indulgent, lazy routine. Every morning he woke to a pincer attack from Sakura and Suzu, two cheerful attendants who had perfected the art of rousing him. He opened his eyes to delicate, delicious breakfasts and the easy decadence of island life, while Mihawk's sword continued to sing on the mountaintop. In the afternoons, he would lie by the courtyard pool, attended by two girls, and listening to Robin read the paper aloud in her clear, melodious voice. Those lazy, pleasant days went on for several afternoons, until this one, when Karen appeared before him, standing at attention with a folder in hand. Lord Kyle, these are the latest financial reports and some intelligence that needs your review, Karen said, handing the documents across. Kyle took the folder and flipped through it without hurry. The astronomical profit figures made him nod in satisfaction. Under his direction, the Xiangbo Islands' underground industries had been turned into a ruthlessly efficient money-printing machine. Karen's business acumen was beyond doubt. He picked up another file and scanned it. An eyebrow lifted. Joker, he murmured. The report stated plainly that an underground organization from the North Blue was attempting to infiltrate the Xiangbo Islands' arms and brokerage markets, and that its leader used the codename Joker. Kyle's fingertips tapped the name on the page as a faint, interested smile crossed his face. He said the name aloud, Heavenly Yaksha, Doflamingo. Then, almost to himself, he added, Speak of the devil. Just as he was worrying about the lack of diversification in his funding sources, someone else stepped forward to offer help. Lord, shall I take care of it? Karen asked quietly, his eyes calm behind his spectacles. If Kyle gave the order, he could make the other side's forces in the Xiangbo Islands disappear without a trace. Kyle accepted the glass of juice Sakura handed him, took a measured sip, and said slowly, Tell your men to break the hand that reached out. Carolta read for a heartbeat, then comprehension dawned. A faint smile crossed his face behind the lenses. He bowed slightly and withdrew. Kyle stretched, rising from the lounge chair as his joints popped. Rest's over. Time to move. He gave Robin, Sakura, and Suzu a small smile and walked straight toward the back mountain. On the training ground, Mariah was developing his devil fruit powers, countless shadows converging and dispersing around him, taking shifting forms and radiating a menacing aura. Nearby, Mahawk sat motionless with his eyes closed, man and sword seemingly fused as the air itself warped under the pressure of his held sword intent. Kyle's arrival shattered the quiet. He didn't shout. His voice was calm, but it carried. Let's go, both of you. Work's here. Mariah stopped mid-training, his massive frame rising to full height. A feral light sparked in his eyes. He hungered for battle, eager to test the power he'd just gained. Mihawk opened his eyes, his hawk-like gaze fixed on Kyle. He said nothing, but the question in his look was unmistakable. Kyle gave a relaxed smile. Let's pay a visit to the Don Quixote family. Teach an arrogant junior a lesson. North Blue, Spider Miles. The town was a study in white, grand, ornate architecture lining every street, the Don Quixote family's flamingo emblem stamped on banners and shopfronts. It had been one of Heavenly Yaksha, Doflamingo's strongholds for years, orderly and prosperous on the surface, with darker currents running underneath. The arrival of 3 uninvited guests shattered that fragile calm. They strode down the town's widest central avenue, making no effort to hide. The man in front had black hair and gold eyes, his face lit with the curious grin of a tourist seeing everything for the first time. He wandered from shop window to shop window, pointing things out like a child discovering a new town. At his side walked a figure so tall and pale he might as well have been carved from moonlight, a permanent sneer hanging on his lips. Locals hurriedly made way for him without being asked. Bringing up the rear was a man with a massive, cross-shaped black blade slung over his back. His hawk-like eyes showed nothing, indifferent, cold, and he moved as if the world around him were irrelevant. As he passed, an invisible pressure seemed to press down on the street. The air itself felt heavy and stagnant. Kyle, Mariah, Myhawk. Together they were flamboyant enough to announce their arrival for them. Hidden in the eaves and doorways along the street, Donkusodi family informants crouched, sweating. Their fingers trembled around their den mushi. None dared risk a movement that might draw attention. "See, little hawk," Kyle said, idly, as if they were on a leisurely stroll through his own neighborhood. "The architecture here is quite something." Mihawk didn't bother answering. His gaze swept coldly over the concealed scouts, as if inspecting a group of corpses. Then a voice burst out of the shadow, a harsh, booming laugh that echoed down the street. "Kiha! What a boring place. There isn't even a decent opponent here." Gecko Mariah's laugh was sharp, edged with impatience. "Don't rush." Kyle stopped by the fountain and looked up, calm, toward the grandest castle perched on the distant hilltop. Donkusode Family Castle, Council Hall. The air inside was heavy, thick with tension. The family's top executives sat together in silence, heads bowed, each afraid to draw the ire that radiated from the throne. Seated in the huge chair, legs crossed, Doflamingo's trademark pink feathered coat hung behind him. The sinister smile usually twisted on his face was gone. His short blonde hair stood on end from anger, a vein throbbing at his temple. "Why is this information only coming to me now?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a chill that resonated through the hall. Wave Motion King, Aaron Keel, Shadow Master, Gecko Mariah, Hawkeye Myhawk. These three are already swaggering down the town's main avenue, and you're only now telling me that you've located them. His fingers rapped the armrest in a staccato rhythm, thump, thump, each hit punctuating the room's oppressive silence. Each word landed like a hammer blow to the executives' hearts. "Didn't I already tell you? Xiangbo Islands is off limits. Don't provoke that man." His voice snapped up, and an invisible wash of Conqueror's hockey rolled out before he clipped it back into an impossibly small radius. Even so, the men nearest him felt their hearts stutter and their breaths catch. The oily treble hurried forward, trying to smooth things over. Now, Doffy, don't be angry. Kyle's always been unpredictable. He has no fixed ship and never keeps a regular route, so our intel has a hard time tracking him in advance." "Excuses," Doflamingo cut him off. Tribble flinched, but swallowed his fear and went on. "I figure his visit has to do with that mess a while back. One of the lower bosses, an incompetent little fool, got greedy over the profits from brokering arms around Xiangbo Islands and went off on his own." "Went off on his own?" Doflamingo repeated those words, sarcasm so sharp it practically hardened into stone. Can some low-level nobody really draw monsters like that to come in person? Doflamingo felt the words sink like a stone. He knew the other side wasn't here by accident. That minor boss was nothing more than a convenient pretext. They had been targeted. A cold prickle ran down his spine. He'd been moving his pieces across the North Blue, pushing into the new world. Everything had been unfolding exactly as he'd planned. Kyle's sudden appearance was a huge, destabilizing variable, one that could overturn his entire chessboard. "Doffy, what do we do now?" Diamante asked, his voice rough. Doflamingo rose slowly and crossed to the tall, that floor-to-ceiling window, looking down over his domain. "They're here with ill intent. Send the order. Tell everyone." He didn't finish. Pika, who had been motionless and silent, his body like a mountain, snapped his head toward the hall's entrance. Diamante and Treble stiffened as well. Something was wrong. Even though the castle gates were tightly shut, something was seeping through the seams, not light, not wind, but shadow. Like ink diffusing into clear water, thick, viscous shadows, reeking of something foul, silently oozed from beneath the doors and quickly spread across the polished marble floor. The air in the council hall stiffened instantly. Not a figure of speech, the change was physical. From beneath the tightly shut castle gates, a thick, viscous shadow seeped in, like ink bleeding into clear water. It crawled across the pristine marble floor, staining it in seconds, and climbed the walls. Wherever it passed, the very atmosphere turned heavy and oppressive. Treble's gooey form recoiled, his perpetual smile vanished. "This is," he began, voice faltering. Diamante drew the long sword from his waist and went into a defensive stance without another word. Pika, huge as a mountain, barked in a muffled roar that echoed through the hall. "What is this? How dare you be insolent in front of young master?" At the head of the table, Doflamingo sat, his face so stern it looked as if it might drip. He had seen this before. "Gecko Moria, the Shadow Master," he said coldly. The dark mass smothered the floor in moments and began to crawl up toward the walls and ceiling, trying to swallow the chamber whole and turn it into a realm of darkness. Then, without warning, a flash of emerald green light tore through the gloom. Boom! A streak of light cleaved the castle's massive main gate, frame and all, so cleanly the cut gleamed like a mirror. The doors split in two and exploded inward. A shower of splinters and dazzling light poured into the hall, driving back the gloom. The emerald green arc of energy, its edge razor-smooth, did not slow. It drove straight for Doflamingo on his throne. "Don't even think about it," Diamante bellowed, whipping his long sword. His flowing cape stiffened at once into a slab of steel, folding upward into a giant shield to take the blow. Pika was even faster. He slammed his palms to the floor, and a thick wall of stone surged up behind the cape. A screech rent the air as the emerald slash met the steel. The impact sang with a grating, teeth-gnashing sound. The hardened cape split open under the strike as if it were paper, and the light punched on, shearing through the stone wall as well. It carved a yawning, seemingly bottomless fissure into the floor before the brilliance finally guttered and faded. Diamante and Pika both grunted as the impact forced them back. As the dust settled beyond the shattered gate, three figures stood clearly outlined against the cold north-blue sunlight. One was a giant, his mouth pulled into that trademark kishishishishi laugh. Another gripped a black blade, hawk-like eyes sweeping the hall with bored indifference. Leading them was a black-haired man with golden eyes, hands buried in his pockets, and a placid smile that somehow sent a chill down the spine. Kyle stepped forward, unhurried, into the palace of Doflamingo. Tap, tap, tap. The crisp echo of his footsteps filled the ruined hall, each step sounding like a stomp on the hearts of the Don Quixote family executives. "Stop him!" Treble screamed, swinging his slime-covered cane toward the intruder. Diamante and Pika exchanged a sharp look, forcing down the shock that threatened to show on their faces, and moved to flank Kyle from left and right. They were Doflamingo's most trusted top executives, the family's shield and spear, and they would never allow anyone to get near their king without a fight. Kyle didn't so much as glance at them. He simply kept walking forward. An invisible aura, as heavy as a mountain, radiated from him. It wasn't a violent gust or a crashing storm, but a more elemental, absolute pressure, the kind that seemed to come from a higher plane of life. The air thickened into something like viscous syrup, and time itself felt as if it were slowing. Diamante and Pika, mid-charge, froze as if someone had pressed pause. Cold sweat broke out on their brows, horror filling their eyes. Every muscle, every cell, screamed the same primitive warning, fear, and locked their limbs rigid. The gooey Treball simply collapsed to the floor, trembling like a lump of wet clay. The council hall fell completely silent, except for the sound of Kyle's footsteps. Hands still in his pockets, he walked through the immobilized executives with a casual, almost indifferent air, as if merely passing two unimportant statues. Across the shadowed floor, through the chaos of slashed banners and torn furnishings, he walked, step by deliberate step, straight toward the throne. Doflamingo sat planted in the massive chair, his eyes hidden behind his signature sunglasses. The veins at his temples stood out like cords. He gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles went white, leaving deep impressions in the wood. At last, Kyle's footsteps stopped at the foot of the throne. He simply stood there, looking down, and his figure cast a shadow that swallowed Doflamingo whole. It wasn't as thick and oppressive as Mariah's, but the pressure it brought was unlike anything Doflamingo had felt before. Don Quixote Doflamingo? Kyle's voice was calm, cutting through the suffocating silence. Doflamingo, a pleasure to meet you. A muscle twitched at the corner of Doflamingo's mouth. He forced away the anger and the flicker of something darker, forcing a stiff, false smile. Fu-fu-fu. The The wave-motion king gracing my humble abode. What an honor, he said, laughter hollow. Have any of my men offended you? I can hand them over for disposal. He tried to steer the conversation, making the incident sound like the mistake of an ignorant subordinate. Kyle smiled. The laugh was low and soft, but it chilled the air in the great hall, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. Doflamingo's smile froze. His voice deepened as he rose to his full height, nearly 3 meters, and the pink, feathered coat wrapped around him like a challenge. He took 2 measured steps forward, trying to seize back control of the room. "This is Spider Miles," he said, nodding at the man beside him. "This is my territory." Even behind his dark glasses, his stare felt like a blade aimed straight at Kyle. "Even if you are one of the strongest on the seas," Doflamingo warned, "if you act recklessly here, you need to think about the consequences." He let the words hang for a moment, then enunciated each syllable slowly, deliberately. "Just so we're clear, my family name is Donquisode." The name carried weight, enough to draw the attention of admirals in Marineford. Donquisode, one of the 20 kings, the once great founding families of the celestial dragons. It was Doflamingo's greatest trump card and the source of his deepest wounds. Kyle simply raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Donquisode?" he scoffed, as if the whole idea were the most laughable thing he'd ever heard. "So what?" Kyle's voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Do you honestly think that group of good-for-nothings in the world government would go to any lengths to bother me over a stray dog like you?" Stray. Dog. Those 2 words hit Doflamingo like twin red-hot brands, searing deep into old wounds. They ripped open the most painful parts of his childhood, being paraded and mocked by commoners, the shame of being led away from the Holy Land by his own father. Memories he had buried and tried desperately to forget, now exposed for all to see. His face went rigid, then slowly contorted into something ugly and unnatural. Veins stood out on his forehead, knotted blood vessels throbbed beneath his skin, as if something inside him might burst. His trademark laugh came out dry and hollow, a strangled, rasping sound that faded into silence. "What do you know?" he spat. A suppressed roar tore from his chest. Boom! An invisible blast of air, centered on him, radiated outward in all directions. Black and red lightning erupted around him, snaking like a spiderweb across the walls and ceiling of the council hall. The marble floor groaned under the strain as cracks raced outward from beneath his feet. Conqueror's haki, raw, oppressive, absolute. Under that domineering aura, Demani, Tribol, and the others went pale, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. This was their king, yet none of them had ever seen Doflamingo like this. Flustered, enraged, unhinged. "Young master!" Pika's shrill cry cut through the hall, but the haki pushed him back like a physical force. Doflamingo ignored everyone. His eyes were hidden behind his sunglasses, but they must have been bloodshot with fury and madness. He spread his hands, fingers curling like claws. Whoosh, whoosh! Hundreds of white, barely visible threads shot from his fingertips, striking walls, ceiling, and floor with terrifying speed. They braided and interwove almost before anyone could register them, forming a giant net that covered the entire chamber in the blink of an eye. "Birdcage," Doflamingo growled. At his command, the net, countless razor-sharp threads, began to contract, closing in slowly and inexorably. Every thread was honed like a razor. They sliced through the air with a high, hissing whisper. Where the net brushed the crystal chandelier overhead, the glass exploded into 1,000 glittering splinters that drifted silently down. "Overheat!" Doflamingo roared. He swung his arm, and several threads braided together into a thick white whip. The tip, armored with dense armament haki, became a dark blur as it cut through the air and cracked straight for Kyle's head. At the same time, his other hand flashed. All 5 fingers flicked. 5 color string. 5 threads, each a different color, shot from his fingertips like invisible blades, aiming at Kyle's neck, heart, and limbs from 5 cunning angles. It was Doflamingo's finishing sequence. Conqueror's haki to stun the spirit, the birdcage to seal off escape, overheat for a crushing frontal strike, and 5 color string for the hidden kill. The maneuvers flowed together seamlessly, enough to throw any formidable opponent off balance. One small mistake, and they wouldn't just be defeated, they'd be torn apart on the spot. At the entrance to the hall, Mariah let out a sinister, excited grin. The shadow behind him stirred restlessly. Mihawk kept one hand on the hilt of his black blade, Yoru, his hawk-like eyes narrowing. Kyle, hands still in his pockets, stood perfectly relaxed, the playful smile on his face unchanged. A whip of dark shadows sliced through the air with a bark of thunder. Threads in 5 colors sealed off every angle. Above them, the birdcage, a web of countless filaments, began to contract, each strand flashing with an icy light that could slice steel. This was Doflamingo's ultimate killing domain. His face had settled into a cruel, supremely confident expression. He was sure no one could slip out of this trap intact. The remnants of the old era belonged in their graves. Then, a split second before the threads would have closed on Kyle, something unexpected happened. An invisible aura surged out from him, but it was not Doflamingo's violent, raging conqueror's haki, not a furious storm. It felt less like an attack and more like a bottomless, tranquil sea. No waves, yet carrying an absolute weight that could swallow everything. A low resonance rolled through the hall. The black and red lightning crackling around Doflamingo flickered like a candle in a gust and then quietly guttered out. The domineering aura he'd unleashed slammed into an invisible barrier and was flattened, smoothed into nothing in an instant. Where the violent energy had been, there was now an absolute pressure that made the soul itself tremble. Doflamingo's face went slack. He could feel it clearly, his connection to the threads being torn away by some superior force. In the next heartbeat, the overheat whip, capable of shearing mountains apart, unraveled, fell limp in the air, and collapsed into a soft bundle of white strands that dropped to the floor. The 5-color string, attacks that had come from crafty angles, lost all their bite and strength, sagging like ordinary colored cotton threads. And most terrifying of all, the bird cage above them began to contract. The cold sheen along the countless threads of the giant net dimmed in an instant, and the whole birdcage began to vibrate with a strained hum as if it might collapse at any second. Kyle finally spoke, his voice lazily bored. In the ace of absolute haki, these are just cheap tricks. Haki transcends everything, he added. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. Doflamingo's pupils snapped tight. He wanted to back away, but his limbs felt as if they had been filled with lead. Kyle moved unhurriedly in front of him, raised his right hand, and casually rested it on Doflamingo's shoulder. Ah! Ah! Doflamingo let out an involuntary, ragged groan. His once proud frame seemed as fragile as rotten wood beneath that power. His bones protested with creaks, and his insides felt as though an invisible giant hand had closed around them and tightened. With a heavy thud, the arrogant Doflamingo, the underground king of the North Blue, could no longer stand. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to one knee on the marble floor. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, running down his chin and staining the bundle of white thread at his feet. A hairline crack split one lens of his sunglasses. The council hall fell into a heavy, stunned silence. At the entrance, Diamante, Trebol, and the other executives were only just regaining feeling after Kyle's haki shock, but what they saw froze them in place. Their king, the young master they had always believed unbeatable, was forced to his knees by a single hand, coughing up blood and unable to stand. "Young master!" Pika's shriek cut through the hush as his massive rock-like form lunged forward. "Kishishishishi!" Mariah's trademark laugh answered. He stepped out into the hall, and the enormous shadow behind him stirred like a living thing. Crimson eyes opened in that darkness and pinned themselves on Pika. Across the room, Mihawk didn't even draw his sword. He only rested a hand on the hilt and cast a cold, hawk-eyed glance at Diamante and Trebol. That single look tightened their throats and snuffed out the anger and courage that had just flared in them. Kyle didn't even bother to look back. He only stared down at Doflamingo, kneeling before him with a cold, appraising gaze. "Remove the trash," he said, his voice flat and indifferent. At his command, Mariah chuckled. The massive figure, shadow looming behind him, moved toward Pika. Mihawk, unconcerned, stepped forward and walked slowly in the direction of Diamante and Trebol. Confronted with their young master in captivity and the obvious, overwhelming difference in strength, the Don Quixote family's top officers didn't even think of fighting. They were easily, almost perfunctorily, escorted out of the council hall. Boom. Mihawk let the heavy castle gate fall shut. Silence settled over the chamber. Only Kyle remained, and Doflamingo kneeling at his feet. "What does it matter to you if I destroy you?" A deathly silence fell over the council hall. Doflamingo was on one knee, his head bowed. His pink, feathered coat lay rumpled behind him, and blood leaked from the corner of his mouth, staining the scattered white threads of his strings beneath him. A hand rested on his shoulder. Though it carried no apparent weight, it pressed down on him like the mass of an entire island, pinning him so he couldn't move. His vaunted string fruit now looked absurd, childish, mere cat's cradle, against the opponent's oppressive, unreasoning hockey. Humiliation and anger churned in his chest, with a pulse of fear he refused to admit even to himself. Then a suppressed laugh cut through the quiet. Foo. Doflamingo raised his head slowly. Between heavy gasps, a manic smile spread across his face. The blood at his mouth made the grin all the more sinister. "You can't kill me," he rasped, voice hoarse but raw with certainty. "I am a celestial dragon. Even if I'm not in the Holy Land, that doesn't change the fact that I'm a world noble." It was his final card, a privilege written into his bloodline. Doflamingo wore a confident smile, but Kyle didn't flinch. He leaned down, close enough that his warm breath ruffled Doffy's cropped golden hair, and spoke softly into his ear. "Do you remember God Valley, Doffy?" The smile died on Doflamingo's face. Long-buried memories, sealed away for years, were suddenly pried open. He was a child again, clutching at his naive father's hand as their family of 4 traveled to that island under the guise of observing celestial dragons. Then everything collapsed. The sudden savage assault by the Rock's pirates, and the cataclysmic battle that followed. Cannon fire thundered, pirates laughed like they were tearing the sky apart, slaves howled, and towering, terrifying figures moved through the chaos, crushing hope itself. When it was over, the surviving celestial dragons fled in panic. The official report, quieted and buried by higher-ups, mentioned, in vague and unnerving terms, 3 strangely shaped sea beasts that had attacked scattered groups of celestial dragons on the island and left heavy casualties in their wake. The thought was outrageous, almost ridiculous, yet impossibly real. That possibility detonated in his mind. Behind his cracked sunglasses, Doflamingo's pupils shrank to pinpricks. For a moment he couldn't form the word, impossible. Then Kyle's soft, almost devilish murmur confirmed his worst fear. "You're exactly right," Kyle said. "I kill celestial dragons." The statement hit him like a blow. Everything Doflamingo had built his life around, the unassailable law he'd relied on, the bloodline protection he'd flaunted, crumbled in an instant. What he had always taken for granted now looked like a joke. An icy tide of fear crawled up his spine and flooded his skull. For the first time he felt death so close he could taste it. "Why?" he stammered, voice trembling. "How dare you?" Kyle straightened slowly, adopting the same disdainful posture he'd worn before. His golden eyes were flat and godlike as he looked down at the terrified flamingo at his feet. "Why should I have a reason?" he asked evenly. Doflamingo raised his head, horror etched across his face, peering at the man through the cracked lenses. No explanation was necessary. Kyle's actions needed no justification. Killing celestial dragons required no reason. Tearing down the Don Quixote family required none either. Like a man who crushes an ant without a second thought, simply because he can, Kyle had the power to decide Doflamingo's fate. Doflamingo knew, without doubt, that this man truly dared to kill him. It wasn't just bravado. Kyle's arrogance sprang from absolute power, the kind that could ignore the rules of the entire world. Doflamingo's mind unraveled. Childhood nightmares and present reality collided. The humiliation of being beaten by commoners, his father's weak, hollow tears, the cold, indifferent steps in Mary Gioi's, the blood-soaked massacre at God Valley, had been swept under the rug, every memory funneled into the smiling face before him. Kyle looked down at the man at his feet, his mental defenses in ruins, and slowly raised his left hand. He pressed his fingers together until they formed a blade. Doflamingo's pupils pinched to slits. He wanted to dodge, to fight, to use any means to survive, but his body would not obey. As that hand blade descended, he could feel the cut through the air, ember, a precise trajectory traced toward him. Death hovered so close it felt real. Then, at the last instant, the blade grazed the tips of his golden, upright hair and missed. In an instant, boom, The rock and steel of the castle behind Doflamingo split open in a smooth, massive gash. Half the fortress and the mountain behind it sheared away and slid down, collapsing as if some god had scraped a chunk out with an eraser. Sunlight poured through the breach, casting Doflamingo's slumped silhouette long across the ground. He was on his knees, dazed, cold sweat soaking his pink-feathered coat, his whole body shaking. If that hand blade had dropped another centimeter, he would have been decapitated on the spot. Kyle retracted his hand as if he'd just done something trivial. He lowered himself until their eyes met, and a soft smile returned to his face. "Doffy, you're something else." The unexpected compliment short-circuited Doflamingo's thoughts. Kyle's smile grew a fraction colder. "You're pure evil, and I'll admit, I respect that, but evil without strength is nothing but a child's game, isn't it?" He leaned in, his golden eyes flashing behind Doflamingo's cracked sunglasses. "Tell me, do you remember why those commoners nailed you to the wall back then?" Doflamingo's body convulsed. He swallowed hard, voice barely steady. "Was it because of your father Homing's naivety? Was it the celestial dragon's centuries of cruelty that had finally sparked this revolt?" "No," Kyle said, "nor that." He touched Doflamingo's chest with a single gentle finger. "It was because of weakness. Weakness is the original sin of this sea. Your father was weak and couldn't protect his family. You were weak then. You could only watch your mother die of illness and be fixed to a wall as a warning, humiliated and helpless. Every ounce of your suffering, every grudge you've ever held, comes from the same place. You weren't strong enough." Kyle's voice never rose, but each word cut cleanly, ripping open a truth Doflamingo had worked so hard to bury. The blond man's breathing came faster, his chest shook, and Kyle could see the rim of red behind his lenses. Kyle's smile widened, warmer now than before. "Be my right hand, Doffy." He offered the invitation to the man whose will he had all but shattered. "You, abandoned celestial dragon who has seen hell, follow me, and together we'll unleash a grand revenge on those unworthy swine." Kyle rose, slipping back into his familiar posture of disdain, arms spread wide as if to embrace the whole world, chin lifted in contempt. "In this world, only I can make your ambition a reality," he cried. "Only I can lead you back to Mary Geoise and let you personally nail the celestial dragons there, one by one, to the wall." For a long beat, the council hall fell silent. Sunlight poured through the huge breach in the castle, cutting through the air and setting the drifting dust to dancing. Doflamingo lay slumped on the floor, head bowed so no one could read his face. His body had stopped trembling. Then, from somewhere deep inside him, foo-foo-foo-foo. A laugh, long suppressed and finally unleashed, utterly mad, rolled through the ruined chamber. 149. Devil Bird. The pirate ship cut through the icy waters of the North Blue, the spray from its bow throwing the sunlight into a million glittering fragments. On deck, the mood could not have been more different from the oppressive stillness inside Spitamire's castle. "Is that all, Keel?" Mariah broke the quiet, his massive frame propped against the rail. His trademark kishishishi laugh sounded, but there was a trace of annoyance beneath it. How boring. There wasn't even a proper fight. That rockman, Pika, and that floating swordsman, if I'd been able to kill them, I'd have gotten 2 high-quality shadow soldiers for sure. He licked his lips, the crimson of his tongue stark against his deathly pale face, and the regret was obvious. Across from him, Mahawk stood with his arms crossed, his hawk-like eyes reflecting the blade's cold light. In a flat, measured tone, he offered his assessment. "That man doesn't seem like the type to obey orders. Objective, blunt, and accurate. A man like Don Quixote Doflamingo, pure malice and arrogance flowing through his veins, would hardly bend after a single setback." Mihawk hesitated for a moment after speaking. He couldn't shake the memory of Keel's casual hand chop, just flesh and bone, yet it had carved a line sharper than any famous blade. Does a swordsman always need a sword? The question hovered in his mind. "Of course not," came a lazy reply. Keel was sprawled in a deck chair, sunglasses on, a glass of iced juice in hand, completely relaxed. How could a flamingo born in hell surrender easily? He took a long sip and sighed with satisfaction. Right now, he's nothing more than a mad dog with its fangs temporarily blunted and a collar slapped on. A biting dog doesn't bark. If he's quiet, it's because he's plotting something nastier. Mariah bared his teeth. "Then why did you let him go?" Keel pulled off his sunglasses, revealing gold eyes that glittered with amusement. "Who said I let him go?" he smiled. "I don't want a loyal dog. I want a vicious one that will bite when I tell it to." As for loyalty, to him it was no more dependable than a well-made dog leash. PUA is a technical skill. He had never expected to take Doflamingo down in one clean sweep on this trip to the North Blue. The plan was far subtler, to absorb the Don Quixote family's entire underworld, its global arms trade, intelligence networks, and smuggling routes, and turn them into his own. Doflamingo was little more than the public face of those operations, a manager in name only, a puppet whose strings he held, and to whom he had dangled the promise of revenge. "All right, quit standing around, Mariah." Keel slid his sunglasses back on and gave a casual wave. "Time for our little birds to go sing." Mariah answered with a strange, hollow laugh. He rose to his feet, his enormous shadow unfurled and crawled across the deck. He shut his eyes and focused, drawing in a slow, deliberate breath. Swoosh! From that living shadow, clusters of pure darkness peeled away, condensing in midair until they took the shape of palm-sized jet-black crows. They weren't physical creatures, but manifestations of shadow, insubstantial yet unmistakable. 2 points of cold blue light served as each crow's eyes, and they moved with a quick, unnerving agility. After his awakening, Mariah had continued experimenting. He discovered that by killing weak creatures, he could strip their shadows, each one containing a sliver of the creature's soul, and sculpt those fragments into intelligent, controllable shadow beings. The little shadow birds he made served as Keel's mobile eyes and signalers. The shadow crows wheeled once in the air, gave a silent, piercing cry, and uncoiled into a ribbon of black smoke that streaked away like a gust of night. Keel sat cross-legged, unmoved, and said casually, "Morgan's stupid news-coos fly all over the seas, don't they? Have the shadow birds quietly parasitize the shadows of those news-coos. They'll be able to hide their tracks and pick up everything the moment it happens. What do you think?" Mariah's eyes brightened at the suggestion. His kishishishi laugh grew louder. A few days later, the rumor mill exploded. News raced across the Grand Line and through the 4 seas, and the front page of the World Economic Journal blared the story in the boldest, most sensational type it could find. Shocking! Tenyasha and the wave-guiding king clash in North Blue. Don Quixote family defeated. Spittemeyers changes hands. A photograph taken from an awkward angle filled half the front page. In the background lay the shattered ruins of a massive castle, split and torn apart. In the foreground, the silhouettes of Keel, Mayhawk, and Mariah were unmistakable. In the corner of the frame, several retainers propped up a bloodied, disheveled Doflamingo as he fled, panic written across his face. The article itself was even more extravagant, casting the clash as an earth-shattering battle. It painted Doflamingo as a ruthless but heroic figure who had the audacity to draw his sword against the legendary pirate known as the Wave-Guiding King. Though he was ultimately overwhelmed and driven from his family's centuries-old stronghold, the fact that he had somehow slipped from Keel's grasp was hailed as an extraordinary feat. For a while, the whole sea was in an uproar. That Tenyasha actually dared to fight the Wave-Guiding King? He's lost his mind. Not just fight. According to the paper, he survived. That's incredible. I heard from my uncle's daughter-in-law's neighbor's second uncle's sister that the Wave-Guiding King is a monster. He can go in and out of Marineford 7 times without getting taken down. What are you talking about? Go in and out 7 times where? Marineford, of course. Ah, right, I see. So this Doflamingo is way stronger than we thought. As the rumor mill reached a fever pitch, the world government and Marineford moved quickly. Before long, an even more explosive headline swept the globe. World government extends olive branch. Tenyasha, Don Quixote Doflamingo, invited to become one of the 7 warlords of the sea. That announcement cemented Doflamingo's reputation. Recognition from the world government, an invitation to join the sanctioned ranks of the 7 warlords, was about as definitive proof of strength as one could get. Far from diminishing his name, the battle had only made Tenyasha Doflamingo more notorious, his renown echoing across the seas. In the room of authority in Holy Land, Mary Giois, the 5 elders read the reports in front of them, their expressions mixed and unreadable. "Isn't it too rash to make the Donkusode boy a Shichibukai?" someone asked. "Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures," the financial god of war replied. "The seas are already thrown into chaos by those two bastards, Roger and Keel. We need a force that can counterbalance rival pirate crews." "He's got a very unusual background," another voice said. "Because of that, he understands the value of rules better than most. And, crucially, we have leverage over him. Most importantly," the financial god of war added, "he's one of the few who lived through Aaron Keel's hands. That alone gives him credibility with the lawless. We need a blade like that to face other blades." "It's decided," the financial god of war concluded. "Have the CP agents contact him. A vicious dog that's been tamed is always easier to control than a lone wolf roaming free." They didn't know that the vicious dog they were preparing to pen, fresh from hell and intended to be put among the sheep to keep other wolves in line, already had a chain fastened around its neck, one forged in the abyss. Sabadi Archipelago, 24th Grove area. Keel folded the newspaper and set it down, a satisfied smile on his face. Everything was under control. He tossed the newspaper onto the table with a casual flick, reached for the steaming black tea that Sakura and Rin had brewed, and took a slow sip. "Oh, the devil bird returned from hell. Let the flames of vengeance burn," he murmured. "Now standing before you is the most wicked remnant of the old era. The uncrowned king who dominated two eras, the regulator of the underworld, the collector of the Shichibukai, the angel investor of the Revolutionary Army and a genius scientist, the wave-guiding king, Aaron Keel." 2 years had passed in the blink of an eye. There was no time to mourn the irretrievability of those lost days, because everything had already changed. 2 years ago, in the North Blue, Keel plucked the feathers from that flamingo, Doflamingo, and fitted him with the splendid, counterfeit wings of a Shichibukai. After that, Keel's name disappeared from the public eye, like a boulder slipping beneath the waves. But beneath the currents, an invisible net had been cast. Centered on the Sabaody archipelago, it quietly spread across the seas. Karen, taking Keel's will as his guiding principle, extended the tentacles of this new order from Sabaody to the 4 seas and became the public administrator of the system. Doflamingo, wearing the mask of a Shichibukai, lurked in the darker shadows, ripping into and devouring the illicit industries that fed Keel's reach. One cloaked in light, the other in shadow, one white, one black. They forged an unprecedented underground empire. Mariah's creations, countless shadowy things that mimicked flowers, birds, insects, and fish, slipped into every corner of the world like ghosts. Those creatures quietly made a strategic partnership with Morgan's. They latched onto the shadows of every news coup, listened for the faintest ripple or rustle anywhere on the globe, and funneled that information straight to Keel's desk as fast as it could travel. In return, Morgan's was handsomely rewarded. He received enough funding to open newspaper bureaus even on the moon, and the military protection to hold his ground against any threat. As Morgan's would later put it, "At first I refused, but the offer was too much." And Mihawk? He took up the post as the most loyal of all, the Imperial sword guard at Keel's villa, unwavering and ever-present. Besides his daily sword practice and sparring, he was regularly dragged into chess matches and tea-time debates with Keel. Long, meandering discussions over questions like, is the essence of the sword idealism or materialism? Robin took on the role of the villa's librarian and Keel's personal secretary. She organized their vast sea of intelligence with quiet efficiency and livened Keel's lazy routine with her mordant, dark-humored asides. The twin maids, Sakura and Suzu, handled Keel's day-to-day needs and looked after the lodging and meals for everyone at the villa. Their cooking improved by leaps and bounds under Mihawk's friendly guidance. Perona, for her part, happily became the villa's mascot. Her chief concern each day was figuring out how to use her negative hollows to make the man who always lounged in a beach chair reading the newspaper feel that same crushing despair, to have him think, "I'm sorry I was born." Meanwhile, at Marineford, the new fortress rose more magnificent and more solid than before. Yet the high-level conference room felt even more oppressive than it had during the Dragon Lion Rebellion 2 years earlier. A Marine Vice Admiral had just finished his report. On the projection screen, Aaron Keel's grinning face, his bounty listed at 4.1 billion, seared itself into the attention of everyone in the room. At the head of the long table, the new Fleet Admiral Sengoku rubbed his throbbing temples as he read the latest assessment of Kiel's forces. The situation was so bad, he briefly felt that even the goat that had once trailed him and chewed his papers would be less troublesome than what lay ahead. Sakazuki's voice cut through the room like a blast from a furnace. Heat shimmered in the air, and a faint smell of sulfur rolled across the council chamber. The Sabaudi archipelago has become a nest of evil, he said. Aaron Kiel is entrenched there, openly flouting the world government's authority. I propose we launch a buster call on Sabaudi immediately. Erase that nest of evil, and Aaron Kiel with it, from the map. He slammed his fist down on the table. The impact scarred the wood black where it landed. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the scorched surface. "Oh, how frightening," Borsellino drawled, legs crossed, leaning back as if nothing could faze him. "But Sakazuki, Sabaudi archipelago sits right under the nose of the Holy Land Mary Geoways. If we launch a buster call there and disturb the celestial dragons, won't the Gorosei be furious?" "For absolute justice, any sacrifice is acceptable," Sakazuki replied without a flicker of doubt in his eyes. A crisp crunch suddenly cut through the silence. Everyone turned to see Vice Admiral Garp, as unconcerned as ever, shoving rice crackers into his mouth. "A buster call?" "Don't be ridiculous, Sakazuki," he mumbled around a mouthful, then swallowed and popped another cracker in. "With the current Marines, even if we threw all our elites at it, we might not be able to hold that kid Kiel." He burst into booming laughter. "And if he gets away? Knowing that brat, the whole sea would be in chaos. We'd have one hell of a headache. Waha!" "Garp," Sengoku finally snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "No eating during the meeting." Sengoku's temples throbbed with irritation, but against his old friend he could do nothing. Sengoku could only turn to Sakazuki and say, "Garp makes a good point. We need to deliberate this. We can't afford to be rash." Sakazuki didn't answer, but the temperature in the conference room seemed to climb a few degrees, as if his silence made the air itself burn. At the same time, Kuzan, wearing an eye mask and slumped back in his chair, swayed slightly as if about to nod off. Ever since the Ohara incident and his clash with Kiel, the brilliant Marine who had once personified burning justice had become oddly languid. The massacre and that battle had left him changed. Seeing Kuzan drifting off, Garp suddenly stood up and seized him by the back of the collar. "Hey, Garp, the meeting isn't over yet," Sengoku snapped. "I've heard enough," Garp said, shrugging as if it were no big deal, and popped another rice cracker into his mouth. With that, he started hauling the half-asleep Kuzan toward the door. "Kuzan, wake up. You're coming with me on a business trip to East Blue." Garp-san, I'm still on vacation," Kuzan mumbled, voice thick with sleep, his feet scraping the floor and leaving 2 faint parallel marks. "What vacation?" Garp said, already half out the door, and dragged him after him without waiting for an answer. "Young people should be more active. Ha 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 ha!" The laughter rang out one last time, then the conference room door slammed. Left behind were a red-faced Sengoku, the unreadable Sakazuki, Borsellino calmly studying his fingernails, and the rest of the Marine officers in stunned silence. Sengoku's gaze went to the 2 empty chairs, and he let out a long, weary sigh. A familiar ache began to twist in his stomach. The great pirate era had only just begun. Chapter 151, 2 Hasty Years. The villa on the Sabaudi archipelago, with its steaming hot spring, felt like something out of a storybook. "Oh, a hot spring. A big milky one," someone squealed. Kyle, a grizzled old sea dog, lounged against the warm stone, arms splayed. Sakura and Rin knelt at his side, one on each shoulder, carefully washing him as steam softened the edges of their faces until only 2 shy blushes showed through. Kyle let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Before I know it, I'll be almost 40, he murmured, sounding mockingly woeful. "Time doesn't spare anyone." "You're not old, Lord Kyle," Sakura protested at once, her small face flushing. Whether from heat or indignation, it was hard to tell. "You're the most handsome and formidable man in the world." "Absolutely," Rin agreed, nodding earnestly from the other side, her voice low but sure. "Lord Kyle will never grow old." Listening to their earnest defenses, Kyle kept his eyes closed and leaned back, letting the warm water lap at his neck. "Well then, what are we waiting for?" "One more round, brother," he said with a mischievous curl to his words. Ripples spread in concentric circles across the surface of the hot spring. Late that night, when everything had fallen quiet, on the large bed, Sakura and Rin slept soundly, their breathing steady and their cheeks still flushed from the night. Kyle lay between them, his mind long since stripped of worldly desires and unusually clear. 2 years had been enough to change the course of the world. Mariah's crow had returned bearing the final news from distant Wano. The 5-year arrangement between Kazuki Oden and Orochi had expired, and Oden, ever the earnest samurai, had only at the last moment realized that the promise had been a deception, a Kaido-engineered ruse to crush the people's hope. Furious, Oden led his retainers, the 9 red scabbards, in a desperate charge on Onigashima. Their plan was betrayed by a traitor, however, and the end was never in doubt. Kazuki Oden fell. His legendary life came to an ignominious end in a pot of boiling oil. Orochi assumed the title of shogun as he had wished, while Kaido became the real power pulling the strings in Wano. Kyle gave a soft sigh. Oden was dead. There was no use arguing about what had been. Oden had been too naive. He'd believed that every strong person on the Grand Line was as righteous and loyal as Roger or Whitebeard. He didn't know the truth. He didn't even know whether that brat, Momonosuke, was still alive. The thought of Momonosuke made Kyle feel sick. He was plainly still a child, but he had the manner and appetites of some lecherous old man, always somehow leveraging his youth around women. Worse than that was the damned idea everybody kept hiding behind, the bloodline. Cowardly, weak, shirking any real responsibility, a man who refused to honor the sacrifices of those who died for him, and yet so many were willing to risk everything for him. Why? Because Kazuki blood ran in his veins? Because the 9 red scabbards were prepared to give their lives to keep him safe? Because Luffy wanted to install him as Wano's shogun, unworthy of his position, and yet everything was handed to him without struggle. Kyle's contempt hardened into anger. To hell with the bloodline theory. He would not stoop to help someone he found so disgusting. His eyes went cold. There was no longer any question in his mind. He would not lift a finger for that brat. If that was the case, he needed a new kind of hero, someone who could legitimately take control of Wano country, someone who had actually stood up to Kaido and lived to tell the tale. In Kyle's mind, the pale, broad face of Mariah rose like a memory. In time, he would present that man, the hero who defied Kaido, Kazuki Mariah, to Wano. Protecting the innocent there was, for Kyle, also a matter of honoring Oden. He rose quietly, careful not to wake the 2 girls sleeping beside him. He slipped a silk robe on without fuss and padded barefoot across the floor. Moonlight poured through the tall French window, woes and washed the study in a soft, silvery haze. On the desk, 2 letters lay waiting. They hadn't come by the usual news coup. A crow had dropped them off some time earlier. Kyle opened the first. The paper bore Crocus's bold, energetic hand and smelled faintly of disinfectant. The short line on the page read simply, "Kyle, thank you for the information." He read it twice, folded the letter back down, and let his thoughts settle on the plan that was already forming around that single name. Then he turned to the second envelope, the moonlight catching the edge of it as he prepared to see what it might bring. "I brought Brooke back, but it's complicated. In short, it's messy, but Laboon's over the moon, and that song, Bink's Sake, is finally finished. Decades of waiting, a promise that had spanned life and death, had at last reached a perfect ending." A smile slipped across his face before he even noticed it, a small, honest relief. He opened the second letter. The handwriting was wild and unrestrained, full of showy swagger. It was from Jabba. "Kyle, I found a wife. A real whopper. I hear your territory's getting bigger and bigger. You're not a kid anymore, and I'm sure you've got plenty of people around you now. Take care of yourself, brother. Don't burn out too young." "Ha ha!" Kyle's expression went dark. That old bastard, still behaving like a fool at his age. He balled the paper up without thinking and flicked it. The crumpled letter described a neat parabola and dropped into the wastebasket in the corner. The old crewmates from Roger's ship had long since scattered and made their own lives. Kyle's thoughts drifted back over the past year, to when he'd crossed paths with Shanks and Buggy, each of them already making a name for themselves as rising stars on the sea. He had first met Shanks in a tavern on a tiny, unnamed island. The man who had once sailed with Roger no longer carried the boyish innocence Kyle remembered. A saber called Griffin hung at his hip, and his whole bearing had a new gravity. "Brother Kyle, I'm going to form my own pirate crew." Shanks lifted his glass. For the first time, Kyle saw a seriousness in him that went beyond booze and bravado. Kyle clinked his glass against Shanks's. The crisp sound was swallowed by the din of the crowded room. "Where will you go?" he asked. "To see the world, and then to find an answer." Shanks didn't say more. Kyle guessed the answer had something to do with the celestial dragon's bloodline. When Kyle pressed for news of Buggy, Shanks gave no straight answer. He simply tipped back his cup, drained the strong liquor in one swallow, and laughed, big and free, like a man who had already decided his course. Shanks's meeting with Buggy had been in the East Blue. There, in another dilapidated tavern, Captain Buggy stood on a table, 2 hand-picked recruits at his side, berating the room with grand promises. "See, I am the future pirate king. I will carry on Captain Roger's will. Captain Buggy." He spread his arms and spat for emphasis as his followers stared at him with fanatic eyes, hanging on every ridiculous, raucous word. Kyle's eyes caught a black-haired man drinking alone in the corner, and for an instant he went rigid, his words dying on his tongue. Then the man's face brightened, and he practically threw himself at Kyle, scrambling across the floor. "Wah, Brother Kyle! What are you doing here? Did you come all this way just to see me?" After a few coaxing words, Kyle asked about Shanks. Buggy, who had apparently been listening, reacted as if his tail had been stepped on, exploding into a rage and spewing curses at that red-haired bastard for his ingratitude and betrayal. When the commotion died down, Kyle crossed to the window and looked out over the moonlit Sabaody archipelago. In the distance, the coding craftsman's workshop was still lit, and the tourist district's bustle hadn't completely died even at this late hour. Under his gaze, the world felt like it was heading toward a new climax. The crews of the old era had each found their paths, and the sparks of the new era were beginning to fly. The morning sunlight turned the bubbles over the Sabaody archipelago into a scattering of tiny rainbows. Unusually, Kyle was up early. He stood alone on dock number 1, the sea breeze ruffling his long black hair, no attendants at his back for once. A medium-sized merchant ship, flying the Merchant Guild's pennant and sent by one of Karen's subordinates, eased into the berth. The gangplank clattered down against the pier, and a half-dozen guards in black suits snapped a salute in Kyle's direction. A gentlewoman was the first to step ashore, followed closely by an energetic little boy. "Rouge, long time no see," Kyle said as he approached, a soft smile on his face. Portgas D. Rouge looked as gentle as ever. Time had been kind to her. Only the faintest lines at the corners of her eyes and the set of her brows hinted at the quiet toughness shaped by motherhood. "Kyle, you even sent people to pick us up," she replied, her voice still soft and slightly embarrassed. "We're family. No need for formalities," Kyle answered, then let his gaze fall to the little boy at her side. 5-year-old Ace still had a little baby fat on his cheeks, freckles sprinkled across his face, and a Band-Aid plastered to his forehead. His short black hair was a bit tousled, but his eyes were bright and full of stubborn energy. "Uncle Kyle," he called. Kyle crouched down to his level, glanced at the Band-Aid, and gave his forehead a playful tap. "Where have you been getting into mischief now? Is that from a fight?" Ace rubbed the sore spot and grinned, showing 2 neat rows of little white teeth. "No, I wasn't fighting. I fell while exploring Mount Kalubo, and Auntie Dadan carried me back." He said it excitedly, completely unaware of his mother's helpless look nearby. He sighed and clung to Kyle's arm. "Uncle Kyle, help me. Mama's grounded me for a whole month." "A month?" Kyle pretended to be horrified. "That sounds brutal." He tousled Ace's hair gently. "Don't be so reckless next time. Don't keep making your mother worry. Maybe when you go back this time, you'll make some good friends, and it'll be safer to explore together then." They chatted as they made their way through the crowded streets toward Kyle's villa. It was Ace's first time in such a prosperous place, and his eyes could hardly take it all in. He stared at the bubbles drifting lazily through the sky, lingered over the rows of curious shops, and soaked in every new sight. When the palatial villa, built into the mountainside, came into view, Ace's mouth rounded into an O. Wow, he breathed, awe written all over his face. Such a big house. Inside, the tasteful luxury left him even more dazzled. Uncle Kyle, Mama told me a long time ago that you're a great pirate. Ace raced in a happy circle across the wide hall until he stopped in front of Kyle, his eyes sparkling with admiration. So do all great pirates live in houses this big? Sugoi. Kyle chuckled at him and dropped onto the sofa, amused. What about you, Ace? What do you want to be when you grow up? That question was like a fuse being lit. Ace puffed out his small chest and announced at the top of his lungs, When I grow up, I want to go to sea too and be a great pirate like Uncle Kyle. Rouge, holding the cup of black tea Sakura had just brought over, nearly spilled it. Her wrist trembled and she forced a wry smile. Kyle simply regarded the boy with interest and didn't answer right away. Ace, seeing Kyle silent, furrowed his brows and propped his chin on one finger as if thinking something over. The hall fell quiet. Then, as if he'd hit on a brilliant idea, he slapped his palms together and said, Wait, Uncle Kyle's already a great pirate. He put his hands on his hips, suddenly very serious, and declared with the solemn confidence of a child, Then I'll become a Marine. I want to be the Marine King. Wah! Kyle choked on his tea and spewed it out in a spray. Rouge, sitting beside him, was completely exasperated by their son's strange line of reasoning and could only shake her head helplessly. Marineford Demeril, Red Fist Ace, she muttered under her breath, half in disbelief, half amused. Kyle wiped his mouth, fighting back a smile, and solemnly ruffled Ace's hair. You know, even though the highest rank in the Marines is Fleet Admiral, Marine King does sound a lot more impressive than Pirate King. But whether you end up a pirate or a Marine, remember the most important thing. His tone softened. Don't make your mama worry anymore, okay? Ace blinked, then nodded earnestly. He looked over at his mother, his eyes bright and determined. I promise, he said, thumping his chest. I'll protect Mama for sure, not like that scumbag old man who just left us and went to heaven. Children's words can be innocent and devastating. Rouge's smile froze, a flash of unspeakable sorrow crossed her face before she smoothed it into tenderness. Ace, don't talk about your father like that. But the heavy mood they all half expected never settled in. Kyle exploded into a loud, infectious laugh, doubled over until tears pricked at his eyes. He scooped Ace up onto his lap and tousled his hair. That's the spirit. Ace, when you become the Marine King, you'll make sure to catch the Pirate King yourself. If Ace really became a Marine, Luffy a pirate, and Sabo joined the Revolutionary Army, wow, 3 brothers ruling the seas. Kyle announced with mock grandeur, a jaunty fanfare imagined in the air. He cleared his throat and his expression turned a touch more serious. But Ace, whether you end up Marine King or Pirate King, there's one thing you can't do without. I know, Ace shot back instantly, leaping off Kyle's lap and snapping to attention. The little boy stood ramrod straight. It's strength, pure power. His sudden solemnity earned a laugh from Rouge, Sakura, and Suzu, who were sitting nearby. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Oh, so you already understand that. Where do you get your strength, then? Ace's face bloomed with pride. He stuck out his chest, lifted his chin, and announced with all the confidence of youth, Of course I train. Not long ago I found a legendary holy sword on Mount Kalubo. I'm teaching myself swordsmanship. Kyle feigned curiosity, cutting in with a playful tone. A holy sword, huh? That's right, Ace replied, eyes bright with conviction. The blade was completely silver white, and the hilt had these strange patterns. Ace. Rouge, who had been smiling gently, finally couldn't help herself. She rubbed her forehead with a half-exasperated smile. That's not a holy sword. It's a broken piece of pipe from Dadan's bathroom. The air went still. Ace's triumphant grin froze and then crumpled. He spun to look at his mother, ready to protest, but under Rouge's calm, amused gaze, all his bravado leaked away. It's not a pipe. His voice shrank until he turned his face away and sulked, puffing his cheeks out like 2 steamed buns. Kyle fought to stifle a grin. His shoulders gave a little shake. He glanced around the hall, and his eyes landed on the silent figure on the corner sofa. My hawk sat there with a cup of black tea, quietly sipping. His hawk-like golden eyes watched the dark, reddish liquid in the cup with detached interest. Kyle spoke to the still sulking Ace in a mock solemn tone. Swordsmanship, huh? It's a deep subject. Teaching yourself isn't easy. He tilted his chin toward Mihawk, as if to say the man on the sofa could teach them a thing or two. Coincidentally, that big brother Mihawk over there has always wanted to learn swordsmanship, but never found the right teacher. Ace, could you take him on? Ace's attention snapped to Kyle's outstretched finger. He followed the gesture and found a stern-faced man sitting quietly, an enormous black cross resting beside him. The sight was odd, but Ace's imagination raced. Uncle Kyle's friend, he can't be a bad man. Wanting to learn swordsmanship means he's got ambition. Ace pieced it together in an instant, and his courage returned. He drew himself up, puffed out his chest, planted his hands on his hips, and marched over with short, determined stride. Des. Hey, are you big brother Mihawk? He called, looking up. Mihawk set his teacup down and looked down at the little boy who barely came to his knees. He shot Kyle a resigned glance, then regarded Ace with the faintest flicker of interest. Unfazed, Ace pressed on. Uncle Kyle said you want to learn swordsmanship. No problem. I can teach you, Ace announced, patting his small chest as if to prove it. Leave it to me. Kyle leaned back on the couch and watched the show with relaxed interest. Even Robin set her book aside and glanced over. Mihawk stayed silent, which Ace took for shyness, so he grew even more enthusiastic. He reached out with a tiny hand and pointed at the huge cross slung over Mihawk's shoulder. Big brother Mihawk, don't worry, Ace said, all sympathy. Once I teach you, you'll be able to protect yourself. Then, you won't have to carry that big cross around every day and pray to the heavens for your safety. Mihawk still said nothing. I couldn't help it. He was so gentle I almost started to cry. 153. Ace's Journey to Shampoo and Magic, Part 2. A flicker crossed Mihawk's golden eyes. The kid in front of him was barely knee-high, yet he was earnestly trying to teach the legendary swordsman, even casting a pitying glance at the massive cross slung across Mihawk's back, as if he thought the man was burdened and in need of prayer. For a moment, Mihawk simply didn't know how to react. Kyle couldn't hold it in. He collapsed back onto the sofa, shaking with laughter, tears streaming down his face. "Ha! Ace," he gasped, wiping at his eyes. He jabbed a finger toward Mihawk and explained to Ace, who was still in full teacher mode, "This big brother Mihawk, he's the one most likely to become the world's greatest swordsman, and that cross he's carrying." Kyle paused for effect. "That's one of the 12 supreme grade swords. It's Yoru." The hall froze for 3 seconds. Ace's smug, sympathetic, and determined expressions shattered mid-change and reformed into a completely blank stare. Ace's small mouth hung open. He stared first at the helpless Mihawk, then at the giant black blade resting beside him. Its presence seemed to cast a shadow all its own. He spun on his heel and, cheeks flushed, pouted like a tiny pufferfish. "Uncle Kyle!" His shout filled the villa. "You tricked me!" He launched himself at Kyle like a cannonball, but Kyle caught him easily by the scruff of the neck. "Ha ha ha, what do you mean, tricked?" Kyle set him down on the sofa. "Consider this your first lesson, Ace. Once you put to sea, you can't judge a thing by its cover, nor measure the ocean with a ladle. And for heaven's sake," he added, shaking his head, "don't go playing the fool, throwing yourself between forces you don't understand just to protect someone else." For the next few days, Rouge and Ace stayed at the villa. Ace, finally out of Mount Kalubo's little starter village, bounced around as if wound with a perpetual motion spring. The incident that had embarrassed him most turned out to be the best thing that could have happened. It gave him a chance to get closer to Mihawk. "Big brother Mihawk, I'm sorry," Ace announced with exaggerated solemnity. He held the short section of pipe he treated as his holy sword in both hands and bowed deeply to Mihawk in apology. Mihawk only regarded him calmly, fingers wrapped around his teacup. "I want to learn swordsmanship," Ace declared. "Real swordsmanship." Ace cried, looking up with the stubborn, simple determination only a child could have. Maybe that stubbornness had moved Hawkeye, or maybe the swordsman was simply bored. Either way, the next few days brought an odd but constant sight to the villa courtyard. The tall, impassive Mihawk stood like a statue, while 5-year-old Ace wrestled with a short wooden sword made just for him, sweating as he repeated the most basic swings and thrusts over and over. "Keep your sword hand steady," Mihawk would say now and then, his voice flat and measured. "Yes!" Ace answered every time, teeth clenched, shoulders burning but refusing to give up. From the side, Kyle watched with wide eyes. To be personally instructed by the man who would one day be called the world's greatest swordsman, what a privilege. Ace, of course, had his own grand visions. He panted between practice sets, bragging at the top of his lungs. Me, Ace, when I'm 6 I'll climb Mount Kalubo alone. He grinned and jabbed at the air. And if I eat the Maramara no Mi, I'll breathe fire. No more spitting. Now that's a real big brother. When he wasn't pestering Mahawk, Ace's curiosity dragged him around the villa to meet its other strange residents. One afternoon, he came face to face with a man taller than any building he'd seen so far, more than 6 meters, pale as a lantern. Ace's mouth fell open. Wow, he breathed, the single word full of awe and delight. He's so tall. Ace craned his neck until it ached. Uncle Kyle said your shadow is really powerful. Mariah, who rarely saw little fans, suddenly brightened. On impulse, he showed off, twisting his hand through the air and making his shadow lift from the ground and dance. Ace watched, mouth open, clapping nonstop. Sugoi! So amazing! Mariah's grin grew, and he was about to let out his signature, Kishishishishi. Then Ace stroked his chin thoughtfully and added very seriously, but it feels kind of gloomy. I don't really like it. The smile vanished. In the next instant, the nearly 7-meter-tall man wordlessly shuffled to a corner, squatted down, and began drawing circles on the floor with a fingertip. A visible wave of dejection rolled off him, an atmosphere of gloom that felt worse than Perona's negative hollows. Later, when Ace found Robin, the mood changed completely. She sat calmly with a thick volume in her lap, so heavy it looked like it could kill someone if it fell on them. And Ace wandered over, curious. Sister Robin, what are you reading? An archaeological report from West Blue, she replied with a smile, closing the book. Then, seeing his interest, she recounted a few of the ancient kingdom's adventures in simple, easy-to-understand terms that had Ace listening wide-eyed. Ace listened, enthralled. When Robin asked him if he could read, he scratched his head, a little embarrassed. So, to be a really strong pirate, you have to read all these books? For the first time, the kid felt something like awe for knowledge. Still, the person who left the deepest impression on him in the villa was the pink-haired girl who called herself the Ghost Princess, Perona. She was thrilled to find someone younger than herself, and naturally, a dash of superiority bloomed. Floating in midair with her hands on her hips, she announced to Ace, "You little runt, when you see this princess, you better bow." Ace, at that fearless age, made a rude face in return. That infuriated Perona. How dare you disrespect this princess? I'll show you my power. Negative hollow. Several pale, whispering ghosts slid through Ace's body. One moment he'd been lively and jumping around. The next he crumpled to his knees with a hollow thud, palms flat on the floor as his color seemed to drain away. "I'm sorry," he mumbled with vacant eyes. "I'm just a fool who shows off with a water pipe. I can't even read properly." "My existence is just a burden to Mama," Ace muttered, slumped on the ground as if holding a small funeral for himself. Rouge appeared with a platter of fruit and paused when she saw her son kneeling there, making a spectacle of his despair. She couldn't help a wry smile. Good times, she thought, never last long. A week later, it was time to say goodbye. The ship Kyle had arranged was already berthed and ready to sail back to East Blue. Ace stood on the deck in a neat little sailor suit, all bright-eyed and restless. The last few days had cracked open a door to the new world for him. Rouge stood beside him, lightly waving at Kyle and the others gathered on the dock. "Uncle Kyle, Big Brother Mahawk, Sister Robin, and Mina." Ace flailed his arms and beamed so wide it could melt snow. "Goodbye, I'll definitely come back to find you all." The ship eased away from the pier, leaving a long white wake behind. Ace's figure grew smaller and smaller, but his clear, cheerful farewell carried back across the water. Kyle remained on the dock, watching the retreating vessel with a faint, contented smile. Chapter 154, Deserted Island, Feed Me Peanuts. 100-meter-long blade of emerald light tore through the sky, crackling with black and red lightning descending like divine punishment. Where it cut, the air itself seemed to cry out, strained beyond bearing. Kyle gripped Nidhogg, the black and gold naginata slung across his back, and swept it upward. A matching, thunderous black and gold arc shot out to meet the emerald slash. The two forces collided and obliterated each other in midair. The instant he struck, Kyle slid several meters to the side. Jagged shadow thorns exploded up from the ground where he'd just been standing, a fraction of a second slower, and they would have impaled him. Kishishishishi. Not a slow reaction, are we? Mariah's gloomy laughter echoed from all around. Then the island's shadows surged. Dozens of shadow soldiers, sword and spear-wielding silhouettes, crept out of the darkness and charged in eerie silence. That damned Mariah, still no manners. Where are your move names? Kyle stayed expressionless as his Naginata, Nidhogg, traced a perfect arc. Lightblade, Heavenly Rainbow Sever. A circular wave of rainbow light pulsed outward from him. The charging shadow soldiers were cut down the moment the wave touched them, vanishing without a sound, as their shattered silhouettes sank back into the ground. As the area cleared, a hawk-like gaze fixed on Kyle. Mihawk had closed the distance without anyone noticing. With both hands on Yoru, he swung a single, brutal downward slash, the intent to cut through everything itself, driving the blow. Kyle lifted Nidhogg to block. Boom! The blades never actually met. Instead, two peaks of haki slammed into one another between them, forming a visible, black, relentlessly compressing sphere of energy that warped the surrounding air. A crushing pressure radiated from the impact. The earth beneath their feet cracked inch by inch, fissures spidering outward. Locked in that deadlock, the ground shifted. The shadow beneath Kyle's feet suddenly twisted and contorted, and Mariah's figure shot out of it in an instant. Mihawk's bulk blotted out the sun. His enormous sword, humming with concentrated haki, came down in a single, overwhelming slash aimed at Kyle's unguarded back. It was a textbook pincer. There was nowhere to go. Kyle let out a muffled grunt and shoved with everything he had. A brutal force ran up the blade and into Mihawk. The great swordsman stumbled, then slid backward uncontrollably for more than 10 meters, gouging 2 deep furrows into the hard rock beneath him. As soon as he'd driven Mihawk back, Kyle, without even turning, whipped his Naginata around in a hair-raising arc and met Mariah's covert strike at an impossible angle. Tremor Mountain, Earth Roar Wave. The end of the Naginata slammed into the ground like a hammer. An invisible shock rolled outward from the impact point and across the island. The solid earth bucked and shuddered, boulders crumbled, and waves of dirt and rock surged as if the whole isle had turned into a furious sea. Dust and debris filled the air, and the two attackers were forced to break off and give ground. Taking advantage of the upheaval, Kyle fell back deliberately, putting distance between himself and his two opponents. The clash tore across the island, blades and shadows weaving together in violent streaks that reshaped the land itself. Ridges were sheared flat, and forests were reduced to blackened stumps as the battle's shockwaves radiated outward. At last the three combatants pulled apart, taking up positions at the corners of an invisible triangle. Kyle crouched, both hands wrapped around his Naginata, feet planted, every muscle coiled in a calm, ready stance. His breath slowed into long, steady inhales. He seemed to sink into the ground, as if drawing the island into himself. Opposite him, Mihawk and Mariah stood deadly still, faces hard with focus. Kyle's aura swelled at a rate none of them had seen before. Mihawk's hawk-sharp eyes glittered. He cradled Yoru horizontally across his chest and began to gather he, sword intent, into a dense, crushing pressure. A faint, emerald light danced along the blade as that lethal presence condensed. Mariah answered with a guttural roar. Shadows, assemble! The island's darkness rose like a torrent and poured into him. His already towering frame ballooned, muscles knotting and bones groaning as the shadow power warped his body into a monstrous colossus. He grew until he loomed tens of meters tall, a demon god towering above the ruined trees. The air itself went still. The sea breeze died, and even the clouds seemed to freeze in the sky. Kyle was the first to break the deathly silence. He drew in a deep breath and let it out in a sudden guttural roar. Dragon Slayer! It was the very same technique that had raised Marineford years before. From his blade erupted a solid black slash in the shape of a dragon, a snarling head and a coiling body, a living shadow of destruction that tore forward. Wherever that black dragon passed, the very fabric of space splintered inch by inch. Mihawk fixed his gaze on nothing but that roaring silhouette. He planted his feet, took his sword in both hands, and unleashed his strongest strike, an immense emerald-green cross of blade energy, over 300 meters long, ripped through the air with the intent to cleave sky and earth alike. Shadow, Lance of Longinus. Moriah, grown to giant proportions, poured everything into his right arm. Countless writhing shadows condensed into a towering lance, radiating a malignant aura. With a terrible throw, it screamed toward the black dragon. Boom! In an instant, the world fell utterly silent. At the center of the island, three titanic forces, each the summit of destructive power, met and collided in a violent, world-shuddering impact. A blinding light swallowed everything, followed by an explosion so violent it seemed to tear at their eardrums. The great, ancient, deserted island beneath their feet, a land that had stood for countless years, began to come apart from the center outward. Inch by inch it crumbled, breaking into dust and shards that were swept into the air and driven out to sea by the raging winds. When the white glare finally faded, nothing of the island remained. Only a bottomless chasm gaped where it had been, seawater roaring inward to form a monstrous whirlpool. A few oversized planks and chunks of driftwood rode the angry swells at the whirlpool's edge. Standing on one of them were Kyle, Mihawk, and Moriah. Moriah had shrunk back to his normal size. He doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping, his clothes plastered with sweat. Mihawk remained as erect and composed as ever, but the hand that clutched Yoru trembled faintly. Kyle's breathing came in uneven pulls as well. It was plain from the way his chest rose and fell that fending off two opponents and unleashing that massive attack had taken its toll on him too. Somewhere among the chaos, a ridiculous childlike voice echoed as if carried on the wind. "Deserted island, feed me peanuts." It hung in the air, absurd against the roaring void and the thunder of the sea. So tired. Kyle sheathed Nidhogg and flopped down onto the log with a long, dramatic sigh. The air of strength he usually carried was gone, replaced by a pouty, whiny expression. So tired! He stared up at the sky and called out in a tiny, defeated voice, "Little Hawk, settled. Extra food for lunch. I want salmon." Mihawk blinked, convinced he must be hallucinating. Kyle, who was normally stern and dignified, had somehow transformed into a cartoonish, chibi version of himself, complete with a lazy fish mask, and was throwing a full-blown tantrum on the log. Mihawk let out a soft, exasperated sigh and pressed a hand to his forehead. A vast whirlpool churned the sea, swallowing the last shreds of the shattered island. The three of them rode a single, oversized plank of wreckage, bobbing absurdly with the waves, Moriah, Kyle, and Mihawk forming a somewhat ridiculous trio. Moriah broke the silence first, sweat beading at his pale chin but a feverish excitement lighting his face. He gave a wheezy chuckle. "Kishishishi, Kyle," he asked eagerly, grinning, "how strong was that move of mine just now? Was it enough?" Kyle, in his usual lethargic state, lay sprawled on the wood, eyes fixed blankly on the sky. He lazily waved a hand in response. "Meh, it was okay," he drawled. Moriah's grin collapsed as if someone had let the air out of him. His broad frame seemed to shrink. "What? No." He dropped his head, crouched, and began idly tracing circles in the wood with a finger, muttering, "That was supposed to be my strongest attack. It even made the island disappear." Mihawk watched the pair with an unchanging expression, then let out a helpless sigh. His hand, still wrapped around Yoru, trembled from the aftershock of that terrifying collision. 5 years had passed in the blink of an eye, the sea still restless, the wheel of time never pausing for anyone. For Kyle and his crew, those years had been ones of hard growth and change. In that short span, 2 of them rose to the very peak of Shichibukai power, while Kyle himself reached the apex of an emperor's strength. Gecko Moriah's power leapt forward. His command of shadows only grew more refined. He spent most of his time around the Sabaody archipelago, but his signature Kishishishi laugh had already become a nightmare for many middle-tier figures in the underworld. Heard at night, it was enough to send them shivering awake. Mihawk, by contrast, had become a legend that rang out across the seas. He'd grown the short mustache he was known for. His eyes had sharpened and settled, his whole presence like a peerless blade never quite drawn. Often he'd sail alone on that small coffin-shaped boat along the Grand Line, seeking out famed swordsmen everywhere, always testing himself, always chasing the title of the world's strongest swordsman. From Vista of the Whitebeard pirates to nameless powerhouses in the New World, countless opponents had fallen to his black blade, Yoru. The throne of the world's strongest swordsman was within reach. He needed only a single opponent worthy enough to place the crown on his head. At the center of it all, Kyle's strength continued to grow. He had long since entered the level the world vaguely called the Sea Emperor, and yet he gave the impression of not caring. Over the past 5 years, he had mostly drifted between stretches of complete idleness and long, aimless voyages, sometimes shamelessly lazy, sometimes a restless sea rover. On the surface, his domain seemed limited to the Xiangbo Islands and their surrounding waters. Beneath that calm, however, an invisible net had already been cast far and wide. From weapons and intelligence to luxury goods, the Merchant Guild under Kyle's command ran operations across the 4 seas, and even had fingers in nations allied with the world government. Wealth and information flowed like a steady river into the heart of the Xiangbo Islands. Kyle was stretched out on a lounge chair on the top floor of his villa, half asleep beneath a broadsheet, soaking up a rare shaft of afternoon sun. A light breeze ruffled the pages. Robin came up the steps quietly with a glass of iced black tea, the condensation beating on the glass, and placed a neat stack of documents on the small table beside him. "Big brother Kyle, these are the latest intelligence reports," she said softly. Kyle grunted, lifted the paper off his face, and sat up, sleep still heavy in his eyes. He skimmed the front page. The headline caught his attention, news of the Red Hair Pirate's latest movements. He flipped through the article with a casual yawn. Shanks, huh? Even pulled Yasop onto his crew, and he's taken in a little girl, raising her as his daughter. Yuta? A crooked smile tugged at his mouth. He chuckled to himself. It was absurdly familiar. Of all people, he'd once opened Shanks out of a treasure chest. How ridiculous that memory still made him grin. He set the newspaper aside and reached for another envelope from the pile. The handwriting on it was uneven, childish, the ink smudged in places. Kyle's thumb paused on the seal before he broke it. As he read, an involuntary warm smile spread across his face. The letter was from Ace, written all the way from East Blue. 10-year-old Ace, in a tone thick with bravado, had written up his great adventures with his new best friend, Sabo. They'd fought wild beasts on Mount Kalubo, hunted for treasure in the junkyard, crashed at Don's place when they were exhausted, and, most important of all, were diligently saving up their dream fund. Of course, Ace left out a few details. When the boys came home battered and bruised, Rouge would twist their ears and drag them inside one by one to patch them up. That was just how she showed she cared. In the letter, he crowed, "Uncle Kyle, Sabo's a great guy, but I think he might be a noble? It doesn't matter. We've promised we'll set sail together when we turn 18. He'd finished with a grinning sun and a little doodle of 2 tiny figures holding hands beneath it. Kyle smiled and stroked the paper, something playful lighting his eyes. The bond between the 3 children was still touching. And yet he couldn't help wondering how things might change with his interference. The Pirate King's son turning into a Marine admiral, the noble boy joining the Revolutionary Army, the Revolutionary leader's child, and the Marine hero's grandson ending up as the Pirate King, fates rewritten, roles reversed. The thought made him both amused and quietly thoughtful. It's a mess. The CPU can't even parse it. He folded the letter carefully and slid it away, then let his eyes drop to the last document on his desk. It was an encrypted internal report, the organization's black and gold dragon emblem stamped on the cover. Short and clinical, the wording smelled of blood. Target, Rob Lucci. Age 13, Operation Insect's Kingdom. 500 kingdom soldiers were taken hostage by pirates. On the grounds that weak justice is not worth saving, Lucci executed all 500 soldiers and the pirate leader, single-handedly ending the incident. CP internal assessment. Passed. Kyle tapped the name Rob Lucci with a fingertip. The lazy half-smile that had been on his face fell away, and a cool, even expression took its place. "So the little monster from CP is starting to show himself," he murmured. He glanced down at the report, then out over the distant blue of the sea. His thoughts drifted beneath the waves, to the island 10,000 meters below. Just a few days earlier, an urgent intelligence dispatch from Fishman Island had landed on his desk. Fisher Tiger, the legendary adventurer from Fishman Island, returned at last after years away, his body a map of scars. He went straight to Ryugu Palace and asked for an audience with King Neptune. No one knew what was said behind the closed doors of the throne room. All they knew was that when Tiger emerged, his eyes burned with the fire of revenge and liberation. Standing in the plaza of the Fishman district, he announced to every fishman and merfolk gathered that he would go back to the human world, to that living nightmare, the Holy Land Mary Geoise, where countless of his kin were kept in chains, and with his own hands he would free every slave. The timing was explosive. Queen Otohime had only just finished gathering the national signatures to show their desire to be relocated under the world government's protection. Now this, what would become of Fishman Island? Kyle rose slowly and walked to the edge of the terrace, the sea breeze tossing his black hair. He remembered the words he had once shouted from the attic in Logatown, facing those 5 supreme figures of world power. The arrogance and provocation of that moment seemed to converge with Fisher Tiger's unwavering silhouette. A cold smile crept across Kyle's lips. "Robin," he called softly. Not loud, but his voice carried clearly to the woman standing behind him. "I'm here." Robin set her teacup down and crossed the deck to his side. Kyle kept his back to her, his golden eyes fixed on the endless ocean, where the water finally met the towering peak of the Red Line. His tone was composed, but there was a menacing gravity beneath it. The lazy, indifferent facade was gone, replaced by the dark, imperial presence of someone poised to shake the world. "Send word," he said. "Tell my hawk and Mariah to finish what they're doing and return at once. And contact Doffy, quietly." 156. Maroa Night. The council chamber in the villa was deathly quiet. Kyle sat alone at the head of the long table, eyes closed, fingers unconsciously tapping a steady rhythm on the polished wood. Tap, tap, tap. The monotonous sound was the only noise in the room, and its insistence seemed to press on everyone's chest. Mariah had swallowed his usual laugh. His pale face was unusually grave. My hawk sat ramrod straight, the red tea beside him long cold, his hawk-like golden eyes lowered and lost in thought. Karen kept a respectful silence at Kyle's left, his breathing barely audible. They were all members of Kyle's inner circle. They knew him too well. He could be lazy enough to spend an entire day in a recliner, bicker with my hawk about what to eat, and joke freely with anyone. But when he grew like this, quiet, focused, everyone understood it meant something world-shaking was coming. The heavy wooden door creaked open, breaking the silence. A figure swept into the council hall in a flamboyant pink feather coat, a defiant smile fixed on his face. Doflamingo. With Kyle San's long-standing hands-off management, he had almost forgotten there was still a master above him. Protected by his Shichibukai title, the Don Quixote family's underworld enterprises had flourished, and the arrogance born of his celestial dragon blood had begun to show again. That comfortable exile in North Blue lasted until yesterday, when a top-secret order from the Xiangbo Islands yanked him back to duty. "Fu, what's this? Why the hurry to call me? What trouble have you gotten yourselves into?" he drawled, swaggering into the room and trying to hide whatever unease the summons had stirred behind his usual insolent grin. No sooner had he spoken than 3 cold stares snapped onto him. Mahawk lifted his eyes, a gaze as sharp and merciless as a blade, as if it could slice through a man's very soul. Mariah turned his hulking head, his bulk melting into shadow but radiating an oppressive, invisible pressure. Even Karen, physically slight and unassuming, fixed Doflamingo with a severe look born of years managing affairs at the highest level. The room was suddenly very, very quiet. 3 different auras braided together in the room, and Doflamingo's smile froze. It felt as if an invisible hand had closed around his throat. He forced a composed expression, pulled out a chair and sat, but his heart was pounding in alarm. Something was wrong, very wrong, wrong to the point that the word felt inadequate. Then the steady tapping stopped. Kyle-san opened his eyes slowly. In that instant, the light in the council hall seemed to dim, as if all brightness were being sucked into those deep golden irises. The lazy, playful look was gone. In its place was an absolute stillness, as dark and fathomless as the deep sea. Under that still calm, there lurked a madness that could burn everything away. His gaze swept across everyone present and settled on Doflamingo. His voice was soft, but it hit like a thunderclap in everyone's minds. "I'm going to." He drew the words out deliberately, as if relishing the hush that fell over the room. Assault Mary Geoise. You could have heard a pin drop in the council hall. Time seemed to stop. A sharp whoosh ran through the air, and Karen's face flushed almost to the point of frenzy. When Kyle spoke, the room changed. One of his followers inhaled so sharply his breath came ragged, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with religious intensity. To him, Kyle's order was absolute, a divine oracle. Assault Mary Geoise? He would have done it without a second thought. If Kyle had told him to destroy the world, he would have obeyed just as readily. Mariah stood with his enormous jaw slightly ajar, bewilderment frozen on his face. He tried to summon his trademark kishishishi, the laugh he used to cut the tension, but his throat felt dry and useless. He couldn't make a sound. Ridiculous. That was Mary Geoise they were talking about. Mahawk reacted with the least emotion. He merely lifted a hand and absently stroked the new stub, blee on his chin with his fingertips. There was no fear in his hawk-like eyes. If anything, there was anticipation. He was already calculating, weighing the feasibility of the plan, imagining the adversaries they'd meet and how they might be overcome. Doflamingo, on the other hand, was shaken to his core. His mind went blank. He felt as if his ears had betrayed him. Assault Mary Geoise? The idea was absurd. He thought it must be some sick joke, or that Kyle had finally lost his mind. He searched Kyle's face for a smirk, a wink, anything to prove this wasn't real. Kyle's expression gave him no comfort. The man's gaze was deadly serious. Kyle's gaze was the kind of absolute certainty that made the world look like something to be held in his palm, a streak of pure madness that treated rules as if they meant nothing. He dared. He truly dared. The thought hit Doflamingo like a bolt of lightning, leaving him numb from head to toe. A fear rising from the depths of his soul instantly shattered whatever arrogance and pretense he had left. Only then did he remember who stood before him. A monster who had once stormed into Marineford alone, a madman who had dared to openly slaughter the celestial dragons. Kyle-san. Doflamingo's voice came out dry and hoarse. He wanted to say more, but no words followed. Kyle paid no heed to his stunned reaction. Calm returned to his voice, but it carried unmistakable authority as he began issuing orders. Karen! Here! Karen snapped to attention, straightening instantly. You stay and hold Xiangbo Islands, Kyle said, his tone eerily composed. After this incident, our underworld forces will inevitably draw the world government's wrath. Use every resource to stabilize the situation. As for our businesses in the underworld, abandon whatever needs to be abandoned. If you save the land but lose the people, then you've lost both. If you save the people but not the land, you end up saving both. Remember, cut off the tail to save the body. Don't let me come back and find there's nowhere left for me to stand. Yes, your subordinate swears to defend the Xiangbo Islands to the death. Karen sank to one knee, his voice ringing out with absolute conviction. Kyle-san gave a curt nod and turned his attention to Mariah. Mariah, half of your shadow army will remain under Karen's command to maintain order and defend the Xiangbo Islands. Understood. Mariah wrenched himself out of his shock and answered in a low, steady voice. Kyle-san's gaze then settled on Mahawk and the pale-faced Doflamingo. He raised a finger and pointed, first at Mariah, then at Mahawk, and finally at Doflamingo. The three of you come with me. To Mary Geoise? Doflamingo's voice trembled. A cold smile curved Kyle's lips, a flicker of amusement in his golden eyes. What, are you scared? Doflamingo froze. Kyle's casual barb slammed into him like a heavy hammer against his pride. Doflamingo looked up abruptly and met Kyle-san's playful gaze. A jolt of perverse excitement ran through him, part anger, part thrill. Did that mean he was afraid? Did he even have a choice? He let out a dry, rasping chuckle. Foo. Pushing himself upright, he braced his hands on the table and straightened his feathered coat. The panic on his face vanished, replaced by a grim, eager grin. What an intriguing proposition, Kyle-san, he said. I never thought this day would come so soon. If you want to play a big game, why shouldn't I see it to the end? He wanted to watch for himself how much disorder this man could unleash. He wanted to see the day those haughty celestial dragons, his own kind, were wrenched down from their pedestals. Kyle-san watched everyone's reactions with a satisfied look. He rose slowly and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, fixing his gaze on the distant horizon as if he could peer through the clouds to where the Holy Land sat atop the red line. Fisher Tiger has already departed, he said quietly, as if stating something trivial. We can't fall behind. At the same moment, below the red line, a small boat lay quietly moored on the blue sea, empty. Fisher Tiger stood alone on the shoreline, staring up at the scarlet cliff that loomed like the wall of a creator god. The red line rose into the clouds, cleaving the world in two and separating light from shadow. His eyes seemed to look through thousands of feet of stone to the city perched atop the continent, the so-called Holy Land, Marineford. That place was the nightmare of countless fishermen. That place was the destination of his journey. There was no fear and no hesitation in the legendary adventurer's face, only a fierce, blazing resolve. That fire in him could set this entire hypocritical sea alight. Baltigo, Revolutionary Army Headquarters. The council chamber was heavy with silence. Around the long table, every senior officer of the Revolutionary Army sat, but no one spoke. At last a voice broke the stillness, hoarse and dry. The East Army ran into a large force of world government troops. They were nearly wiped out. Army Commander Ginny has been captured. Bartholomew Kuma's mountain-like shoulders convulsed. The heavy Bible he had been clutching slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. He didn't look up. He lowered his head, fists clenched so tight his knuckles cracked. Ginny and the others were taken to Marineford, the intelligence officer said, voice tight. Damn it! An impatient army commander slammed his fist on the table. What are we waiting for? We go now and get Ginny and the others back. Calm down, another counselor snapped immediately. That's Marineford. With our current strength, charging in is suicide. Are we supposed to throw away the entire Revolutionary Army to save one group? Are we just going to stand here and let our comrades be humiliated by those celestial dragon scumbags? This is for the greater good. Someone else shot back. The council hall exploded into argument. Voices rose, accusations flew, and the meeting dissolved into chaos. Slowly, all eyes drifted to the one man at the head of the long table who had said nothing, Monkey D. Dragon. The tattoo on his left cheek seemed to darken in the dim light, and the shadows hid his face so completely no one could read his expression. Inside Dragon's head, two very different voices clashed, one cold and strategic, the other raw and demanding immediate action. A voice, calm and ruthless, told him, "The greater good is everything. For the spark of revolution, we must endure any cost. Ginny's sacrifice is necessary. We cannot, on the basis of one moment's impulse, ruin the foundation built with the blood of countless comrades." Another voice exploded in his head. What did we rise up for, if not to stop this? Wasn't our whole point to make sure there would be no more needless sacrifices? If today we abandon one of our own for the greater good, what prevents us from disbanding the entire Revolutionary Army in the name of that same excuse tomorrow? Pros and cons, future versus present, sacrifice versus loyalty. Thought after thought churned through him until he felt like his sanity might tear in two. Then, without warning, a figure stepped into his mind. Black trench coat, unruly golden eyes, a lazy, insolent way of carrying himself, as if the rules of the world were nothing but an inconvenience. Aaron Keel. What would that man do? Dragon didn't have to think to know the answer. Aaron would charge in without hesitation. He would tear Marineford apart, drag those self-styled gods from their thrones, and trample them into the dust, anything to bring back the person he wanted to bring back. The so-called greater good? The weighing of pros and cons? They meant nothing next to a single comrade's life. For a moment it was as if those doubts had never existed. The fog that had settled over his heart, the calculation, the weighing of risks and lives, was cut away by a single, simple clarity. When had he become the sort of commander who counted comrades like statistics? A revolution that could not save its own people was a joke. Dragon slowly raised his head. The struggle and confusion that had been written in his eyes melted away, replaced by a hard, metallic resolve. I'll go personally. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the council chamber and dropped everyone into stunned silence. Ivankov, Kuma. Both of them looked up at once. Prepare yourselves. We'll infiltrate Marineford and bring Ginny back. Kuma, who had been hollow-eyed and broken, finally let a faint light return to his face. Before anyone could reply, the council doors were thrown open with a crash. An intelligence officer stumbled in, panting, horror written on him, and slammed a report down on the table. "Mr. Dragon! Mr. Dragon!" he gasped. "In the direction of the red line! It appeared! It appeared!" Dragon picked up the paper. He read it for only an instant, and his pupils contracted. The intelligence officer's voice trembled as he delivered the news that made the room go cold. "It's Mr. Keel's ship. He's leading a force in secret, heading straight for Holy Land Mary Geois." The afterglow of the setting sun gilded the top of the red line in a holy, molten gold. Perched at the very pinnacle of the world, Holy Land Mary Geois looked in the twilight like a treasure the gods had left behind. Pure white castle complexes, ornate courtyards, every stone and cornice exuding an aura of absolute authority. Lights flared across the city. The celestial dragon's evening was just beginning. In a hall large enough to hold an army, a rare white bear fur from the South Sea was spread on the floor. The young Charlos Saint reclined listlessly on a sofa made of living people. His weight made the slaves beneath him groan, but none dared to shift. "Boring, utterly boring," he complained with a bored scoff. He plucked a translucent grape, dropped it into his mouth, chewed once, then spat it out with a wet, purple juice splattered across a pale-faced female slave. "Bah! This grape isn't sweet enough," he sneered. "Drag her out. Bring a new batch." A slimy strand of snot still clung to Charlos Saint's lip as he spat the order, his voice sharp and petulant. The nearby guards moved at once, expressionless, and hauled the trembling woman away along with the opulent plate of grapes she'd been serving, fruit that would have cost a fortune to anyone outside this hall. "Father, I want new toys," Charlos demanded, turning toward the head of the table. Rosward Saint reclined there with a glass of fine wine, calmly watching the spectacle at the center of the room. Several collared slaves had been forced to mimic dogs, snarling and lunging at one another for a single meat bone tossed to the floor. Around them, the other celestial dragons crowed in shrill, warped laughter behind their carved masks. "My good son, do not be impatient," Rosward said slowly. "A fresh batch of new merchandise arrived today. I hear there's even a member of the Revolutionary Army among them. Quite interesting, isn't it?" "A tough nut?" Charles's eyes brightened. The thing that excited him most was the slow process of breaking someone who resisted. Soon the guards shoved a line of new captives into the hall. They were a sorry sight, rags for clothing, hollow-eyed, faces dulled by numbness and despair. Among the crowd, one figure looked unmistakably out of place, a woman with striking, cropped pink hair. She wore a prison uniform, and her wrists were bound in sea-stone shackles, yet she held herself ramrod straight. Dirt streaked her face, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a coiled flame, barely suppressed and ready to erupt. It was Ginny, the captured captain of the Revolutionary Army's East Army. A celestial dragon noblewoman fanned herself and peered at Ginny with keen interest. "Oh, is that her?" she purred. "Just a commoner, and yet those eyes, they're terrifying. I like her." "Bring her out by herself." Charlos Saint scrambled off his human sofa and hurried toward Ginny, plump finger extended as if to pinch her cheek. Ginny snapped her head away and dodged him. Charles's movement froze, the laughter in the hall died instantly. All the celestial dragons turned to look, a slave daring to resist a god's touch? Rather than anger, excitement lit Charles's face and the fat on his cheeks trembled. "Interesting. So very interesting, yee!" he exclaimed, then called out, "Father, I want to play the hunting game with her." "Granted." Rosward Saint waved his hand dismissively, his voice flat as if settling a trivial matter. The guards moved at once, yanking the shackles loose from Ginny's wrists. "The rules are simple," one of them said coldly. "Run from here to the white wall at the far end of the courtyard. If Charlos Saint's pistol doesn't kill you, you get to live one more day." Ginny said nothing. She flexed her wrists, purple and raw where the metal had rubbed into her skin, and let her eyes sweep over the twisted, arrogant faces of the celestial dragons gathered around, all of them hidden behind their masks. She saw their cruelty, their vanity, the corruption that sat in them like a sickness. "Run, run, little toy," someone jeered. Charlos Saint had already produced a custom pistol, a favorite prop in their cruel entertainments. They loved this, watching something run, bleeding and terrified, still clinging to life. It fed the most vicious part of them. Ginny drew a slow breath. Then, without hesitation, she turned and broke into a run across the courtyard. Bang! Bang! Shots cracked out, and one bullet slammed into Ginny's calf. The pain hit her so hard she nearly fell, but she gritted her teeth, stifled any sound, and kept limping forward. "Oh, ho, ho, ho! Hit her!" came the taunts. "Go, Brother Charlos!" cried another voice. The celestial dragon's jeers and cheers rolled through the hall. Ginny looked tiny in the vast courtyard, staggering on with mocking gods at her back and a wall of despair looming ahead. Night deepened, but Mary Geoise remained a place of revelry, song and dance as if trapped in an everlasting daylight dream. They didn't know that beneath their feet, past the red line and down in the ocean's depths, a storm was gathering, quiet and terrible enough to overturn heaven itself. On a scarlet cliff, a tall red fishman crept up in silence, his gaze cutting through layers of rock, fixed on that sacred light. Farther out at sea, on another ship's deck, Keel stood with his face to the wind, his coat-tails snapping. Behind him, Mihawk polished his black blade. Mariah gave a low kishishi laugh, and Doflamingo adjusted his sunglasses, a grim smile twisting his face with equal parts fear and fanaticism. Against the night, the silhouette of the Crimson Continent was clearly visible. 157. Fire! 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 In the courtyard, Ginny's calves were torn and bleeding. Each step she took left a dark red footprint on the pristine white marble. She gritted her teeth, lungs burning, but she didn't slow. Behind her, Charlos Saint's high, mocking laughter cut through the air, mingling with the shriek of bullets, the most jarring sound in this otherwise sacred place. "Run, Toy! Faster, faster!" Charlos snapped, firing another shot that missed by inches. He pouted in irritation, preparing to take aim again, when a dull, distant thud rolled across the city from the west side of Mary Geoise. Boom! A visible shockwave punched into the sky, shearing the spire off a distant tower. Flames leapt up, painting half the night sky an angry, incandescent red. For a moment everything froze. Even the noise in the hall seemed to stop. Charlos fell silent, glancing irritably toward the source of the explosion. "Who dares play with fire during my hunting hour?" Rosward Saint lounged in the main seat, swirling his wine glass. His cloudy eyes peered from beneath his hood toward the flames, and he said slowly, "Probably some family showing off a new toy. Nothing to worry about." The celestial dragons, used to such spectacles, chuckled and urged Charlos Saint to continue his amusement. To them, causing a commotion in the Holy Land was nothing more than daily entertainment. Their words had barely faded when the building shuddered. Boom, rumble, boom, the detonations came from all directions, one after another, each nearer and louder than the last. The floor trembled, the crystal chandeliers hanging from the dome clinked and swayed, and dust drifted down in a gray rain. This time, no one could stay composed. From the East District to the slave market in the south, and even the noble residences on the outskirts of Mary Geoise, giant fireballs erupted in succession. Black smoke coalesced into enormous pillars that swallowed the city's gilded lights. In an instant, the Holy Land was transformed into a burning purgatory. "What's happening?" someone shouted. "Guards! Where are the CP agents?" Laughter dissolved into screams. "Are they all useless?" someone shrieked. "My pet got scared and peed. Drag it away and get rid of it, now!" another celestial dragon barked. The hall had erupted into chaos as the nobles, panic-stricken, vented their fury and fear on the nearest slaves. One dragon upended the human seat beneath him and began savagely stamping on the trembling body. "Filth! You insects have brought disaster down on sacred Mary Geoise." White-clad figures cut through the smoke and flames. A Cypher Paul agent used Soru and flashed across the room, appearing before Rosward Saint and dropping to one knee. "Rosward Saint, you must proceed to the shelter immediately. The cause of the explosion is still unknown, but we suspect enemy infiltration." "Infiltrated?" Rosward Saint's voice shot up in outraged disbelief. "Who dares trespass in the dwelling of gods?" The agent said nothing, only bowed his head. More CP operatives spread out, some racing toward the blaze, others closing around the celestial dragons to form a human shield, ready to shepherd the nobles to safety. In the chaos, no one noticed that the pink-haired woman, until then treated like prey, had slipped away into the courtyard shadows. No one noticed that, either, a short distance off among the smoldering ruins. As a squad of CP agents rushed past, hurrying to shield another screaming celestial dragon, a heavy stone slab in that shadowed corner began to move. It was pushed aside slowly, and a tall figure climbed up out of the opening. His skin was the color of sunburned copper. In the flicker of the flames, he looked like a god of vengeance returned from the underworld. It was Fisher Tiger. He spared only a single glance for the wreckage and the bodies his strength had helped produce. He did not linger. His target was neither these buildings nor the bloated nobles fleeing them. His eyes cut through the smoke, the heat, and the panicked crowd to fix on the darkest heart Omer, the Holy Land. The hell where thousands of his compatriots and other slaves were kept. His silhouette wavered for a moment in the blaze light, then melted into deeper shadow and moved on. The slave prison of Marigyoas lay below, damp, dim, and reeking of despair and rot. The noise outside couldn't reach them. The thick stone walls swallowed every sound, leaving only the prisoners' hollow breaths and the occasional scrape of chains across the floor. In a narrow cell, a black-haired girl huddled in a corner with her two younger sisters lying behind her, unconscious. The hoof of the celestial dragon was burned into all their backs, a mark of eternal slavery and shame. Boa Hancock. She had long since lost any sense of how much time had passed. Days blurred into a slow, unending torture of will. A faint tremor ran through the cold stone beneath them, like a distant behemoth drumming. Hancock lifted her head. Her eyes that would one day enthrall countless hearts, brightened with surprise and a flicker of doubt. The tremors came more often and with more clarity. Then, from deep below, a dull roar rolled up through the earth. Her two sisters stirred. Sandersonia blinked awake and rubbed her eyes. "Sister," she began. "Hush!" Hancock clamped a hand over Sandersonia's mouth, while her other hand moved to comfort Marigold, who trembled beside them. She pressed her ear to the cold iron door, trying to pick out what was happening on the other side. Screams, roars, the thunder of collapsing buildings, sounds filtered through layers of walls and metal, muffled but unmistakable. Hancock scrambled toward the cell's only window. It was set impossibly high, letting in only a thin wedge of light. She hauled herself up on the cracks in the plaster, footing slipping on the damp stones, and finally forced her face to the narrow opening. Outside, flames clawed at the sky. The night, once as sacred and untouched as a temple dome, had been stained a bloody crimson. Black smoke coiled up into the air, distant castles reduced to dark silhouettes against the blaze, and sparks and falling debris drifted down in a steady, terrifying rain. The Holy Land, her mind supplied the name like a blow, was in utter chaos. The realization hit so hard she froze for a moment, then her heart began to pound. She slid back down from the window, ignoring the ache in her bruised knees, and hurried to her sister's side. "Mary, Sanda, wake up, both of you, wake up!" Her voice was low, but it carried an urgency she had never used before. "Sister? Listen to me." Hancock met her two younger sisters' frightened eyes and spoke slowly, measuring each word. "Something's happening outside, and the guards won't be able to watch us right now." She drew a steadying breath, forcing her heart's frantic pounding down. "This might be our only chance." "A chance?" Marigold's voice wavered. She still didn't fully understand. "A chance to escape." Hancock's tone was colder than anyone would expect from someone her age. "No matter what you hear in a moment, stay quiet and stay close to me. Do you understand?" Her sisters looked terrified and confused, but when they saw Hancock's unusually grave expression, they nodded vigorously. Hancock's eyes locked on the cold iron door, as if willing it to open. Elsewhere in the prison, cages held other merchandise. Guild Tesoro slumped against the iron bars, his gray-green hair matted with filth and his face bruised. He had noticed the disturbance outside too, the earth-shaking tremors, the soul-piercing roars. To him, they were not warnings of doom, but the opening chords of destiny. In his mind, a girl's smiling face grazed his thoughts. Stella. She had been the only girl who ever smiled at him when he was at his lowest, the only one who dared to be kind to someone so wretched. He had sworn to drag her out of that hell. He worked around the clock, stole, risked everything to raise the ransom, and at last scraped together that astronomical sum to buy her freedom. Just when hope was swelling in his chest and he went to claim his light, a celestial dragon, on a whim for mere amusement, bought Stella from him. He lunged to stop it. All he got in return was a savage beating, a broken body, and a one-way trip to this cell. Tesoro, you will definitely become a great person. I believe in you. Always smile. Your laughter is beautiful. Meeting you is my greatest happiness. Stella's words before they took her away had been branded into him, part sweet consolation, part poison eating at his sanity. He hadn't heard that she was dead. That meant she was still alive. As long as she lived, there was hope. Tesoro pushed himself up slowly, fingers clenched around the cold iron bars. Outside the corridor, the guard's hurried footsteps passed by, rushing to protect those high, untouchable gods, not to watch over these lowly toys. Chaos is a ladder. The chaos sweeping the Holy Land was his only ladder out of the abyss, his sole chance to take back everything. Stella. Tesoro breathed the name, and the golden fire in his eyes, long dimmed by despair, flared bright once more. Chapter 158, Chaos. The ship tore through the night, carving angry white scars across the ocean as it raced toward the looming silhouette of the Red Line. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick and suffocating. Bartholomew Kuma sat like a statue, motionless. The Bible he had left behind at the Revolutionary Army headquarters in Baltigo lay forgotten. His mind was elsewhere. Ginny's voice played on a loop in his head, clear, bright, almost incredulous. "Let's get married, Kuma dear." He could still see her cheeks flushed and her eyes alight, as if stars were trapped inside them. He remembered how he had refused. To the world government, the Buccaneer bloodline was an original sin, a curse that invited disaster. He had told himself that he could not, and must not, saddle someone he loved with that fate. He had thought a cold refusal would spare her. Instead, because of him and because of the Revolutionary Army, Ginny had been dragged into the deepest hell. His avoidance had not protected her. It had left her alone to face the worst. Kuma's large hands tightened into fists. The effort made them tremble. His knuckles audibly creaked. The hurt that comes from keeping silent was sharper than any cry. "Hey, Kuma, don't sulk," Ivankov crowed, waggling a pinky in an attempt to break the gloom. "Ginny isn't some fragile little thing. She's tougher than anyone, you hear me? Viha! We'll definitely get her back." Kuma said nothing. He only buried his face deeper in his coat. Monkey D. Dragon stood at the bow, his dark green cloak snapping in the sea breeze. He stared out at the horizon, thoughts already leaping ahead to the Holy Land, and to one name that kept appearing in his mind. Kyle. The suddenness of whatever Kyle had done had thrown everyone off balance. What was he trying to accomplish? Was it merely to bait the world government, or was there a more complicated plan behind it? "Dragon, look!" Ivankov's startled shout snapped Dragon back to the present. All three of them tilted their heads up at once, pupils narrowing. On the summit of the Red Line, the divine dwelling that should have been pristine and untouchable, the skyline was scarred by towering infernos. Black smoke curled and roiled into the night. Even from this far across the sea, they could feel the heat and the sense of chaos rolling outward. Is this Kyle?" Ivankov whispered, jaw hanging open. Dragon said nothing. He didn't need to. This blaze had already done what Kyle must have intended. It had seized the world government's attention. For Dragon, the carnage on the Red Line wasn't just destruction. It was an opportunity. The eruption of chaos would give the Revolutionary Army, scattered across the globe, a precious opening, but it also put them in a precarious position. Should they seize the chance and strike now, or continue to stay hidden and wait? Dragon stood for a long moment before slowly raising his hand, palm turned toward the sea of fire. Wind gathered around him, howling and building into a roar. "Wind will feed the flames," he said, his voice carrying clearly on the gusts. "And it will scatter the seeds of freedom to every corner of the world. A single spark can set a prairie ablaze." As his words faded, a visible hurricane rose up, skimming across the water and rushing straight for Mary Joise. The gale fanned the scattered fires. What had been isolated blazes were swept into roaring serpents of flame that hungrily devoured everything in their path. Chaos would be their best cover. Meanwhile, in Mary Joise at the slave prison, clang! Crash! The last guard went flying from Fisher Tiger's punch, slamming into the wall and sliding down, unconscious. Tiger strode to the massive main prison gate, crimson muscles rippling under his skin. He gripped the cold steel doors with both hands, his arms straining as he prepared to push. "Hoo-ah!" With an earth-shattering roar, he wrenched the gate. rumored to be indestructible, out of the stone wall. The heavy barrier slammed to the ground in a deafening crash, sending a cloud of dust billowing throughout the courtyard. 1,000 stunned faces turned toward the doorway, emotion flickering across numb eyes. Fisher Tiger stood framed in the entrance, firelight throwing his figure into sharp relief, godlike, demonic. "I am Fisher Tiger," his voice boomed into every corner of the prison. "I've come to free you. If you don't want to be slaves anymore, follow me and take your freedom." Silence fell. Then, after a heartbeat of dreadful quiet, a low murmur swelled into movement. One prisoner stumbled out, then another, then a third. At last the flood broke, hundreds, then thousands, pouring from that living hell like a shattered dam. Years of pent-up anger and despair exploded in a single, chaotic rush. Boa Hancock was swept up in the tide, clutching her two sisters' hands so tightly her knuckles ached. Unlike most, she didn't run blindly. She kept her head, watching the faces and the paths ahead, using the chaos as cover as she steered them toward the outskirts of the Holy Land, the direction she still remembered. Gil Tesoro pushed against the tide of fleeing people, frantically searching every face he could see. "Stella? Stella!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of panicked crowds. Still he did not stop, his golden eyes flickering with the last embers of hope in the firelight. High above the walls of Mary Geoise, Kyle, Mihawk, Mariah, and Doflamingo watched the spectacle below as if they were patrons in the best seats of a theater. "Kishishishi! What a sight!" Mariah cackled in his familiar guttural laugh. Mihawk stood with his arms crossed, his hawk-like gaze sweeping the scene, taking in every movement below. Kyle said nothing, simply watching in silence. Doflamingo adjusted his sunglasses, his body trembling with barely contained excitement. He observed the other celestial dragons, once haughty and untouchable, now shrieking and scattering like headless insects. He watched the immaculate symbolic palaces of divine authority buckle and turn to blackened ruin. This was his old home, and the place that had thrown him and his family into hell. A low, involuntary laugh bubbled up from his chest. Fu-fu-fu-fu, he felt neither sorrow nor rage, only a morbid, twisted exhilaration. Burn! Burn even brighter. Reduce this false sanctity, and those so-called gods with it, to ashes. 159, 10,000 me. On the walls of Mary Geoise, Keel closed his eyes. His observation hockey unfurled from him like ripples across a pond, spreading outward in widening circles. The chaotic screams, collapsing buildings, and roaring fires fell away. Those noisy sound waves were automatically screened out. His awareness pierced through walls and crowds, honing in on several precise targets. Among the tide of fleeing people, a man with gray-green hair pushed against the current, calling Stella's name. Golden flames burned in his eyes. His gaze held an unrelenting obsession and a hunger that seemed intent on devouring everything in its path. Gil Tesoro. Keel's consciousness lingered on him for a moment. The Golden Emperor's talent was undeniable. Such potential could not be wasted. Keel's perception swept on, skimming a chaotic courtyard until it fixed on a shadow. A black-haired girl stood fiercely over two younger sisters, shielding them. Unlike the other terrified slaves, her expression was calm and ruthless, ready to strike. Boa Hancock. The thought crossed Keel's mind. Keel glanced around his villa and realized it felt like it was missing a maid. Maybe a combat maid corps wouldn't be a bad idea after all. Hancock, he thought, would probably prefer not to have her sisters wandering around without someone to keep order. A sudden rush of wind came up from below the red line. It carried 3 distinct presences, and Keel turned his senses toward the sea. A ship was cutting through the waves, and at its bow stood a man in a green cloak. The little dragon had actually come. A ripple passed through Keel's consciousness. The little dragon hadn't abandoned his comrades for some abstract greater good the way the Sweating King did in the original story. Instead, his presence came with a clear, blunt message echoing in Keel's mind. You don't understand the revolution. You don't understand the big picture. The Revolutionary Army was still very weak back then. It was true. Fisher Tiger had never been the absolute top among the powerful. In the original timeline, a Marine Rear Admiral with only 20 men could have seriously wounded him. If someone of that caliber could rampage through Mary Geoise and get away, it only underlined how hollow the Holy Land's defenses were at the time. How do you attack Mary Geoise? Tiger's answer was simple. You reach out and take it with your own hands. All the same, the dragon's arrival was an unexpected variable, one that could change the whole calculus. Keel drew his attention back and leaned toward Gecko Moria. Kishi shishi. Leave it to me, Moria chuckled, his form melting into the shadow at his feet and vanishing without a sound. Keel shifted his gaze to the other side. Doflamingo trembled with a twisted, ecstatic pleasure. He pushed his sunglasses up and stared through the lenses at the burning ruin below, his old home and the wellspring of his hatred. "How is it, Doffy?" Keel asked lightly. A suppressed laugh escaped Doflamingo as he slowly turned his head, a crazed smile curling his lips. This is the ultimate high," he breathed. "Go," Keel said calmly. "Whether you watch in silence or go on a rampage, do as you wish. I'll cover your back." Doflamingo's laughter died abruptly. The madness drained from his face, and he looked at Keel in stunned surprise. A moment later, this Teniasha, arrogant to the core, solemnly dropped to one knee and bowed his noble head. The next moment he sprang to his feet. With a barely perceptible flick of his fingers, several threads shot out and snaked around a distant building. He became a streak of light and plunged into the roaring sea of fire and chaos. No one could see his face. The commotion on the city wall finally drew the attention of the CP force below. A CP-9 officer who was directing the on-site response rasped orders, trying to keep some order amid the blaze. He glanced up, and his movements froze as if someone had shoved him into an ice cellar. "Hawkeye, my hawk," he breathed. And the man who can make the very air condense I standing there, the wave-guiding king, Aaron Keel, the man who turned the great pirate era upside down. Voices behind him added the accusation like a verdict. He planned the attack on Mary Geoise. A piercing shriek split the chaotic night. On that sound, every CP member, those fighting fires, escorting celestial dragons, and rounding up fleeing slaves, instantly went still. They jerked their heads up to the city wall, and when they saw the two figures standing there, a cold shock ran from their heels to the top of their skulls. How dare he? How dare he show up here? The momentary horror flipped into seething rage. This was the ultimate sacrilege against the very home of the gods. All units, target the wave-guiding king on the city wall. Take him down at all costs. Protect the celestial dragon, sirs. Do not let him approach Mary Geoise. The orders were almost redundant. Dozens of figures stomped the air and shot upward with sharp sonic cracks, converging from every direction. Soru, Geppo, Moonwalk, Rankyaku, Rokushiki techniques that would terrify any ordinary pirate were unleashed without restraint. Blades of light and shadow sliced through the air, knitting an impenetrable net of death as they closed in on Keel. Each of those attackers was a top CP elite, strength comparable to an officer from Marineford. Keel's face, however, never changed as he watched the swarm below. "Gorosei, are you all just going to sit there?" he seemed to say, and slowly raised his right hand. Black and red storms burst into being out of nothing, howling and raging around him. Immortal art-killing move, myriad me. At that moment the sky darkened, not from clouds, but from something beyond the world. Firelight, moonlight, starlight, all sources of light were swallowed in an instant. A colossal black hand, impossible to describe with ordinary words, extended down from the heavens above them. The lines on its palm were intricate and grotesque. On closer inspection, they seemed to writhe like billions of silent, wailing souls braided together. With a contemptuous indifference, as if looking down on ants, it began to press toward all of Mary Geoise. Time and space itself seemed to thicken. The CP elites who had been charging at Keel froze in midair the instant the hand appeared. The fury and killing intent that had filled their faces vanished, replaced by sheer, paralyzing terror. Then, like puppets whose strings had been cut, they slipped from the air and fell, powerless, one after another. Down below, countless fleeing slaves and panicked guards were crushed beneath the same irresistible pressure, unable to move. They looked up, faces etched with fear and bewilderment, as the black hand continued its slow, inexorable descent. The celestial dragons, always haughty, always crowing about being gods, were making absolute spectacles of themselves. "What kind of monster is that?" someone screamed. "Help! Guards! Guards!" One of them went white, foam at his lips, and simply collapsed from fright. Others followed, keeling over as pungent liquid soaked through their expensive robes. When had these self-styled gods ever felt so close to actual death? Chapter 160. Raising a tiger will bring disaster. A black, gigantic hand stretched across the sky, radiating a terror that went beyond death. It was not mere physical force, but a direct crushing of soul and will. Under that shadow, the holy land of Mary's fell utterly silent. Despair seemed to harden in every chest. Then, from the distant heavens, a complex 8-pointed star magic array suddenly bloomed, spinning and pouring out a cold, bluish light. Presumptuous! A furious roar, like a clap of thunder, full of immutable authority, split the air and shattered the paralysis that had gripped everyone's hearts. The array's cold light lanced through the sky with a speed and reach ordinary eyes could scarcely comprehend. Wherever it passed, the air condensed into glittering ice crystals and even burning flames dulled. The black hand, woven from billions of trapped souls, proved as fragile as a curtain before that light. It cleaved silently in two, then dissolved and vanished. But the slash's leftover energy did not weaken. Still brimming with bone-deep cold, it streaked straight toward Kyle on the city wall. At the last second, a figure shot into the sky. My hawk vaulted high, both hands locked on Yoru, and brought the blade down in a 100-meter arc of emerald green light. Boom! The emerald slash met an icy counterstroke with a thunderous collision in midair. The released energies exploded outward as a gale, sweeping the inferno below to either side and revealing wide swaths of scorched earth. Someone landed on a tower not far from the city wall, bone hooves clacking against the stone. The newcomer had a human torso, but the lower body of a savage skeletal warhorse, and he gripped a long blade that radiated a menacing aura, a first-generation Kitetsu. The man was Ethan Baron Vid Nushjuro, the financial god of war of the Gorosei. He fixed his heavy gaze on Mihawk across the wall. The force of that strike had been ruthlessly pure. Judged by swordsmanship alone, this foe was clearly no inferior. Mihawk rested his black blade on his shoulder, his hawk-like eyes burning with a rare fighting eagerness. He felt it instinctively. This unearthly adversary deserved his full strength. Today might be the day he proved himself the world's strongest swordsman. Just as the tension reached its peak, a lazy voice cut through the silence. "Yo, old fossil." Kyle waved at Nushjuro as if no one else were there. "Long time no see. I'm here to keep a promise I made years ago." Nushjuro's gaze flicked from Mihawk to Kyle, his face darkening like a thundercloud. "A promise? What promise?" "That arrogant boast. I'll come to Mary Geoise myself to find all of you. How dare he?" A hot, humiliating anger flared up in Nushjuro. After Roger's execution, they had agreed to turn a blind eye to Kyle, thinking it a leash to control a dangerous beast. Now it was painfully clear they'd only raised a tiger that might bite back. Worse, there was nothing they could do about him. This was Mary Geoise. Yet if Kyle chose, his strange devil fruit power could, in an instant, lay waste to most of the Holy Land and slaughter more than 70% of the celestial dragons. The thought made Nushjuro's blood run cold. The Gorosei did not mourn the lives of those foolish nobles. They cared nothing for individual suffering. But the authority of the world government was untouchable. If word spread that the celestial dragon's own palace had been brazenly invaded by pirates, that the gods themselves had been slaughtered like animals, the absolute rule and prestige the world government had built over centuries would crumble overnight. They could not allow themselves to lose face. Nushjuro tightened his grip on the first-generation Kaitetsu. The Holy Land that had once symbolized their supreme power had turned into chains around their own hands and feet. A moment earlier, in a lavish celestial dragon palace, exotic fruits with a single bite taken from them lay scattered across the carpet. Stella leaned against the cold marble wall, the heavy slave collar at her throat rubbed raw against her skin. She clenched a sharp shard of porcelain in her fist, her last scrap of dignity and defiance. Then she noticed the shadow at her feet, stirring as if of its own accord. The darkness was no longer merely the absence of light. It writhed and twisted, coming alive. Click. With a soft sound, the collar at her neck snapped, clattering to the floor. Stella didn't even have time to gasp before the shadow surged like a tide and swallowed her whole. She sank silently into the darkness at her feet and vanished without a trace. At the outskirts of Mary Geoise, Boa Hancock and her two sisters had somehow escaped the burning chaos and were catching their breath in the shadow of a massive rock. Sandersonia and Marigold, faces bright with the relief of surviving, turned to thank the sister who had been covering their rear. When they looked back, there was no one there. Hancock, who had been standing watch for them a moment before, had disappeared. In the crushing tide of panicked people, Guild Tesoro tore against the flow like a crazed animal. The tiny spark of hope in his eyes flared into a blaze when he spotted the man who had once bought Stella from him, a celestial dragon. The so-called god had tripped, his bubble helmet knocked askew, and there were no guards around him. Tesoro's head went blank. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward and, to the horror of everyone watching, seized the celestial dragon and roughly hauled him into a nearby alley already engulfed in flames. "Where is she?" Tesoro slammed the noble against the scorched brick, eyes bloodshot as he roared. "The girl you bought! Stella! Where is she?" The celestial dragon, unused to being handled this way, blinked in shock for a heartbeat before his old arrogance snapped back into fury. "Peasant! How dare you touch me!" He shrieked. "Guards! Where are the guards? Kill this filthy bug!" Tesoro's answer was a fist. The bubble helmet shattered under the blow. Hot, smoke-tinged air rushed in, and the celestial dragon clutched at his throat as if he'd inhaled poison, coughing wildly. Tesoro didn't stop. He hit him again, once, twice, each blow landing without mercy. Warm blood spattered across Tesoro's face, but he seemed to feel nothing. The celestial dragon slumped, dazed and reeling. The pain of a broken nose and a new, paralyzing fear pushed him to the edge of collapse. There was no way he could bring himself to remember anything about Stella now. The man beneath him had bought countless slaves, many he'd never even had the time to bother with. Now he babbled incoherently, words tumbling out like loose change. "Which toy? Ah, I remember now," he muttered, voice thick with detachment. "That toy, it was broken a long time ago, so I threw it away. Broken, threw it away." Tesoro's fist froze in midair. The world narrowed until it was only those three cold words repeating themselves. The roar of flames, the distant screams, even the crackle of burning wood faded away. All that remained was the answer. What he had risked everything for, the treasure he'd guarded with his money, his power, his life, was to this man nothing more than a broken toy to be discarded. Money meant nothing. Effort meant nothing. His hopes, the light in his chest he'd clung to for so long, went out at once and settled into a dead, colorless abyss. He moved without feeling, swinging his hand down again and again until his knuckles ached. The speaker under him, this self-styled god who had been hurling peasant like an insult, grew quieter with every blow until finally he made no sound at all. Time lost its edges. When he finally came back to himself, no one could say how long had passed. Tesoro stood there with hollow golden eyes and the bitter knowledge that some things cannot be bought back. He slowly withdrew his hand and looked down at the unrecognizable corpse beneath him, his face blank and motionless. In that instant, the hatred for nobles and their so-called gods, the insane hunger for wealth and power, planted itself like poisonous seeds and began to sprout in the ashes of his heart. He staggered to his feet and stumbled out of the alley, his soul hollowed out. He had to get away. One day, with all the wealth in the world, he vowed he would build an empire of his own, a place where no one could ever reach into his hands and take anything from him again.